Morning, everyone. All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about incorporating a systems approach into conservation planning. Kind of a tag team approach this morning between myself. I'm Dan Ludwig, NRCS State Resource Conservationist here at NRCS. And then after I'm finished up, we're going to pass it over to Tony Anastasi, and then we'll finish up with Mark. So let me get my slideshow going here. Of course, this morning I don't have the button to present in Teams. Interesting. So let me get this going here. All right, can you all see that? See the slide?
Yes, we can see it well.
Okay. So kicking off here, so when we're looking at conservation planning, and those of you who have been around the block for a couple of years here, you're in boot camp too, so you've had some experience planning, and this talk is really looking at that whole systems. Sometimes we get mired away into thinking about seeing a resource concern and a practice to address it. However, what we're going to discuss this morning is there may be multiple causes, and you might need multiple practices in a system to be able to treat that resource concern. So, a little bit we're going to talk about this morning is what is a systems approach, why we should use one, and how do we plan a conservation system? Okay, so what is a systems approach? Kind of mentioned it first thing here this morning, but that system is a bunch of pieces working together. So the idea that things we perceive as one or whole are combinations of individual but interacting elements. So again, thinking about when we're doing our conservation planning, we have practices that interact with each other that will treat a resource concern. Okay, so when we're looking at that, looking at our outcomes can be reached by at least two of these different things. So we can achieve our outcomes by changing one or more of the individual elements, or we can go about it by changing one or more of the interactions. So a little bit about why should we use a systems approach? Why don't we just do this one size fits all, one practice cookie cutter approach? And it comes down to, it's going to improve our understanding of resource concerns and their interactions. Okay, so one of the questions here, and you might have seen this in the field yourself. Why is there a gully in the crop field? But naturally, when it hits that magical line between cropland and pasture, that gully stops. Okay, so, and I think we've seen that a lot. We've got that erosiveness in the cropland, and for some reason, it just stops. But again, looking at why we should use that systems approach, because it improves our ability to offer different alternatives. Remember, as conservation planners, we're developing multiple alternatives for the producer to consider in order to treat the resource concerns that we identify. So again, when we're looking at our alternatives, there's different things we should be looking at. We should be offering alternatives that are effective, reliable, and practical. Okay, looking at that producers' resources and what they have. Are there different alternatives that are cheaper or even free, meaning, the producer has little input into that, or even profitable? So again, looking at a system that is achieving a or is solving a resource concern, but it has this economic return to the producer. Some of it can be management based. So again, looking at the producer, it gives them more ownership of treating that resource concern and preventing it from coming back. And the biggest thing is the alternatives that we're offering should have those clear benefits. So again, we're looking for reduced environmental impacts. Again, these are conservation systems and practices have to have financial benefits. A lot, we're NRCS and our different cost share programs and some of the other programs that are offered through DEP and SCC. Yes, there is that financial offset to help um, offset those costs. But again, there's still a portion of the cost that the producer has to cover. So again, it should be having financial benefits. So again, lower costs, lower inputs, more profits. And it should also be personal to the client. That alternative, if it's something that's cheaper or that free, it's like, hey, look, we presented an alternative. They were able to do it with little inputs. Hey, they fixed it myself. And look, it was easy enough. I can do it again. So again, looking at those systems, giving those alternatives that allows that producer the most ease in achieving solving those resource concerns. Doesn't always have to be a structural practice. A lot of times we can look at increasing our systems approach with management practices that might take the place of a more expensive structural practice. Okay, as I mentioned, starting off, we tend to think about problems or resource concerns as isolated or separate concerns. But if we go out and spend some time in the field, start analyzing why these resource concerns are happening, why do they form, why do they present themselves, you're going to see that they're not always separate or isolated. So, as conservation planners, we're trying to match a fix to the individual problem and then rinse repeat as needed. So, again, sometimes we get that's where we're stuck in that little bit of a rut. Classic example is a gully. Classic gully or ephemeral gullies in a crop field. First thing we might think about is grass waterway, and that's how we always address it. But if we start looking at a systems approach and analyzing why this resource concern is forming, then you know that's going to lend itself to us using a systems approach. But again, if we go with this simple fix, that real issue may still be unaddressed. It may still exist. And, that's where this comprehensive system may be a more effective solution. So some of the takeaway ideas that I'm going to present yet this morning is, and think about this, as the day goes on, and as you get out to the field, and in our sessions next week, and then once you're back in the field doing your work. Resource concerns often have more than one cause. So again, getting out and looking at the landscape, what's going on. So sometimes we think of one thing as causing it, but often they have more than one cause. So therefore, addressing those resource concerns will also involve more than one action or practice. Okay. The other thing we want to think about is every resource concern can be addressed by a variety of practices or alternatives. Doesn't always have to be the same practice every time. There can be a variety of practices that we can use out of our field office technical guide to address these, or even different alternatives that we come up with and present to our clients. And typically, a conservation system involves multiple practices. So again, think about why, when you're writing that typical conservation plan on cropland, you're planning 328 crop rotation, 329 or 345. Why are we doing those together? Why do they often fit together versus just one or the other? So again, start thinking about these systems and how they interact with the resource concerns that are in the field. So, classic example that we'll go through here this morning is, looking at how do we plan these conservation systems. So you can all see the picture. What do we see? What do we see going on? We see that there's a gully going on. What is our typical first response or first thought? We can fix that with a grassed waterway. Why is it that when we see a gully like this, our first reaction is to think about putting in a lot? I should say, a lot of times our first thought is, oh, a grass waterway is going to solve that resource concern of that gully. Okay. But again, as we just discussed, we have many alternatives to treating this resource concern or this gully that we see in the field. Again, don't try to pound the square peg into the round hole. Don't limit yourself and the farmer to just one. Excuse me. Again, thinking of those alternatives, thinking about the systems approach. How can we address this without a costly structural practice? So we start when we inventory resources. So again, you've been through boot camp 1, intro to planning. We talk about the 9 steps of planning. So again, we start with we inventory the resources after we've identified the resource concern, we've determined the objectives. Now we have to inventory these resources and see the symptoms that are out there. So we got to assess and document. So again, we see the gully. But then, we got to start looking at, well, what's causing this gully? Is it management? Is there a compaction issue? Is there an upslope source of water that's maybe concentrated flow that's entering this field? But what do you see about this picture? Where that white arrow is, there's already a grass waterway in this field. So again, what are we seeing, and why is this gully now forming here? And why isn't that grass waterway in the picture, further up in the picture, effectively treating and not allowing this gully from forming? Okay. So we always have to ask ourselves these couple of questions. Why is the gully here? What made this spot the most opportune for concentrated flow to come? And we've seen this too. Why is there a gully nowhere else? There isn't a gully anywhere else in the field. And it happened to pick this spot right here. So again, we have to ask these questions, which is going to allow us to start thinking about, what alternatives are out there, what practices do we need, but ultimately we have to come down to solving what is causing this resource concern. So what's unique about this situation? You ask that question. Is it especially steep? Okay, so you can be looking at this picture. What kind of slope are we looking at in this field? Does there seem like there's a lot of water moving across this site? Has it been a problem for long? Is this one that forms every year and it comes back every year, or is this a symptom of heavy rainfall, an isolated event? Biggest thing is, why is there erosion 50 feet away from an existing waterway? Okay, so we got to think about what makes this system, this situation unique. And it comes down to resource concerns often have more than one cause. So moving forward and how we're planning our conservation systems, again, we're moving through the 9 steps of the planning process. We continue as we analyze the resource data. Okay, we use the completed resource assessments. You know, by now everybody should be familiar with running Russell. Russell 2, calculating what the expected erosion losses are, and sheet and rill. Okay, how many of us are taking a penetrometer out to the field, poking around, looking for compaction? In pastures using PCS, using wildlife evaluation guides, T-charts, and so again, we want to see what we want to go out to the field, see what it's telling us. Also, run our assessments to help us determine why is this problem happen. And again, we're doing this so we can identify the possible cause or causes of this concern or multiple concerns. So again, what are the possible causes of this? Is it just it's just happening just because, or are there management things that's going on with this? Are there issues with the practices or how the practices are laid out? Um, Cost, obviously, as we mentioned, there is a cost associated with implementing conservation practices. So starting to, as we analyze the resource data, what's going on? Why is this gully forming? Do we have reduced infiltration? So again, compaction. Is there a plow pan? Is there something going on in this field that's not allowing the water to infiltrate, therefore it's running down the hill? Do we have too much exposed soil? Again, has this producer considered managing residue, planting a cover crop? What about the organic matter content? Because we know that in addition to getting water to infiltrate, we need that organic matter to allow that water a place to go when it hits that field. Also, looking at the water flow, you know, what's happened over time? Is there an increased amount? Is there been a change in velocity, how fast that water is moving across the field, or a frequency? Or is there more concentrated flow? What's going on up above this gully, that might be impacting and causing changes to water flow through a concentrated flow area? So compaction, yes, it could be there. Exposed soil, I would probably say, big cause of some of this reduced infiltration. Reduced organic matter, well, we've got our infield soil health assessment that will allow us to look at organic matter in addition to what Russell will tell us from our SCI values. Looking at the water flow, probably there's increased flow, velocity, or frequency, and maybe more concentrated flow. We got to see what's going on above this field. Just see if is there a culvert that's going in? What's going on that might be causing more concentrated flow to come across this area. So why, we also have to look at why. So if we determine that there's an infiltration issue happening, why is infiltration not happening? Is there too much tillage? Is there not enough residue? What's going on in this producer's crop rotation? Why is there new or more water entering this road culvert? Did PennDOT or somebody put in a new one? Did they replace it? Did they make it bigger? Depending on what rainfall has been like, has there been a spring or a seep in this field before? Did something change that now we've got water expressing itself on the side of this hill? And most importantly, why is the water not reaching the existing grassed waterway? And what we have to look at is, why is the waterway that's existing not enough? Was it designed big enough to carry the flow of the water that's concentrating in that field? Was it not put in the right location? Should have been in a different part of the field. Should it have been moved over to where the gully is? Why did that location get picked? Do we let the producer influence us on where that should go? Or did we or did the planner not pick up on something as far as putting it in the right location? And also maintenance. Again, there's, these conservation practices that we're installing are not maintenance free. So, is there something going on with this grass waterway that's not allowing the water to flow through it, and now is finding a new path. Excuse me. So again, going back to this root thought, resource concerns often have more than one cause. So again, thinking about a single practice to address this often is not enough to truly address the resource concern, so it doesn't come back time and time again. So again, then we have to evaluate the alternative or the alternatives that can address the causes. So what are some of the alternatives that are going on? You know, can we avoid crops in wet areas? So if we've got a spring or side hill seep, should we be farming through that? What's the ability of restoring function of the existing waterway? Should it be mowed more frequently? Does it need to be cleaned out? Is there something going on with the inlet or the outlet of that grass waterway that's not allowing the water to get into it or actually leave it? If there's new water coming in, do we have to look at rerouting new water to this restored waterway? Looking at reducing tillage. Probably if you study this picture or hard enough, you're going to see that there's some pretty fine soil particles out there. So is there an ability to work with the producer to reduce tillage? What about their rotation, including winter grains or cover crop? Installing a hay strip, something to shorten the flow length of the water that's coming down across this field. Also, some of the non-traditional things. If this farmer is a dairy producer or livestock producer, can they start using some bedded pack as fertilizer, which not only is going to get them the nutrients they need to grow the crop, but again, it's adding residue, it's adding organic material to these fields to help with water infiltration versus it running off. So again, truly addressing a resource concern is often going to involve more than one action. So again, producer, we have to look at our alternatives. It's going to take more than one action to really address this. So again, one action of installing a grass waterway, is that truly going to affect and eliminate this resource concern? So, our systems that we should have that we're planning when we evaluate our alternatives, they should be based on multiple goals. And again, these are the goals that should be presented to the producer, and they can, or our clients, and they can pick and choose which of the goals they have. We have a lot of talk about soil health. Work with a lot of clients that want to improve their soil health. They may have, may be in need of erosion control to be in compliance with environmental regulation. Water quality and quantity, air quality. As you see, the list goes down. But what do you notice about these different goals and resource concerns? They follow our SWAPA plus H&E. So again, when we're doing our assessments, again, in our benchmark situation, we should be assessing these operations for the RMS system, but then we can plan to a progressive level. So again, if we're doing a good job ourselves and we're doing our initial assessment and documenting the benchmark condition and RMS systems approach, that's what's going to give us more opportunity to work with the producer to implement conservation systems versus individual practices. So again, common theme that keeps coming back in just about every slide. Again, every resource concern can be addressed by a variety of alternatives and systems. And we're looking at, what are the goals? How can we tie as many of the producers' goals together to address the resource concerns and present the different alternatives? So again, if we focus on, filter strips, yes, filter strips will do a lot for trapping sediment, preventing nutrients from entering the water, the surface water. But again, talking to the producer about, what are these going to do? So again, soil health. You're going to have permanent vegetation, less compaction. They can start turning on these, maybe use these as for turning versus farming right down to the edge, or farming end rows, and which is going to have an effect on their production. Again, water quality, filtration, shading, stability, air quality. Again, if we have permanent vegetation, we can achieve greenhouse gas reduction. What are the benefits to for forage if it's wide enough? Again, if they've got livestock, you know these filter strips still need to be maintained. One, so they can, they do have to be harvested, so they effectively trap sediment, and also their goal is to take up nutrients. So you have to harvest and remove residue from the site to get the nutrients out of there. And again, looking at your cropping system, these sensitive areas, it doesn't make sense to keep planting these low yielding areas. Again, so again, looking at all the different SWAPA resource concerns, they present a lot of opportunities and can address a lot of the goals that producer may have. So again, you know, one practice can do a lot, but let's think about, if we do a systems approach. Again, we're trying to prevent soil from moving off the fields and getting into the surface water. We're trying to prevent um, nutrients from getting into the surface water. While a filter strip is going to do some of that, can it do it all? No, we know we might have to start looking at these different practices to help truly address the resource concerns and prevent them from happening over and over again. So again, you can see that can be anywhere from windbreaks, contour filter strips, grass waterways, wetland restorations. But again, if we use this systems approach and a goal is of the producers for soil health, all of these practices is going to help, because look what's going on. We're getting long-term vegetation happening in these fields. Again, erosion control. When we're planning this systems approach, they're all doing, we're preventing a lot of soil from moving across those fields because we're cutting off flow lengths. We're adding in those trapping practices. Again, water quality, same deal. You know, um, again, I won't go through this whole list, just in a sake of, so we can keep moving on this morning. But again, I think you should now just be getting the a good idea of why we should be looking at these systems and using a systems approach when we're doing conservation planning. So again, imagine additional benefits if we start combining, you know, reduced tillage with cover crops, with nutrient management, grazing management, forest management. Again, every resource concern can be addressed by a variety of alternatives and systems. Keep in mind, long-term vegetation is always your friend. So again, we're not talking about always incorporating permanent hay into a rotation. We're talking about long-term vegetation. Again, contour filter strips, grass waterways filter strips, long-term vegetation. So you should be seeing by now, every one of these practices rely on long-term vegetation as a major part, and that's why they're so effective in doing what we need them to do to address the resource concerns on these fields. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Tony. Because what we're going to look at is, now we've talked about a systems approach to, planning. Mark's going to finish up with the concept of avoid, control, and trapping. But, Tony's got some interesting maps that will show why we're tying the systems approach to avoid, control, and trapping. So, um, I'll go ahead and introduce you, Tony. Um, Tony is our business tools coordinator here at the state office. If you were just at CD and CART training last week, you met him. Um, but he is one of our expert map makers, and amongst other things. We shouldn't just rely on Tony for maps. He's big into our mobile technology and everything. So, with that, I will shut up and let Tony.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. First of all, I have some slides I'd like to show, so I'm gonna share my screen here. So I don't know if is that visible?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay,
we can see
perfect.
that.
That's SEEP. Okay. All right. So what I want to talk about is, yeah, some data we have access to that can help with, and it's really specific to this avoid, control, trap that you're going to hear about again and again. It's a really big focus, but we have some data that can help both to identify priority areas on a large scale. So looking, where in the county are the major concerns that are in need of avoid, control, trap practices, but also on a micro scale, looking at in a single field, what have we done? What can we still do? What parts of the operation are the most in need of work? Um, so this data I'm talking about comes from SEEP, which is the Conservation Effects Assessment Project. This is a huge project. It's been going on for a long time. A lot of agencies are involved with it, but NRCS is uh, kind of running it, and it's way larger than what I'm going to talk about today. They have assessments and data on every land use for every resource concern you could imagine. Uh, Really, I'm focusing on their cropland data for the avoid, control, trap practices, and so that's really specific to resource concerns involving like nutrient, sediment, pesticide leaving the field. Whether that's through surface runoff or leaching. Um, So there's two layers that come from SEEP that I'm going to talk about here is SVI and the CCBI. So first of all, SVI is the Soil Vulnerability Index, and that's just taking the soil survey data, just the soil survey data, and looking at it from, there's a ton of different attributes in that data that they're pulling and putting into a complicated formula to try to estimate what soils are going to be the most vulnerable to those types of resource concerns. The second part that I think is more interesting is the CCBI. That's the Conservation Benefits Indicator. Yeah. And what that's doing is taking that SVI data and it's looking at NPAD. So that's our database, our planning database of all the practices that NRCS has applied in the last 15, 20 years. And by looking at both of those, it can kind of get an idea of where were the priority areas and where have we already done some work and where do we still have work to do. So there's a baseline based on that SVI, and then there's the kind of the present priority level, which is based on all the work we've already done. So I'm going to show you two sources of this data. There's one is in Conservation Desktop, and I realize maybe not everybody in this training has access to that, but I do want to start with that because I think it does a really good job of explaining what the data really looks like. And I think most of you have CD access, so yeah, and this is for ACT. So there's in the map preferences, or layer preferences in Conservation Desktop, we have 15 layers in this Conservation tab here. And they're divided really into, there's really 5 layers, and there's 3 sets of them. So they're split into surface, subsurface, and subsurface undrained. Because, right, there's totally different considerations if you're thinking about surface runoff versus deep percolation, leaching, like that kind of thing. And then also if we are looking at subsurface, whether there's tile drainage out there or not, is a pretty big factor on how that works. So those are kind of split up into those categories. But the first part of it, this is the SVI data, and it's just high, moderately high, moderate, low vulnerability. So these are the vulnerable soils that are predicted to need the most work. Again, nothing replaces a field visit, right? You can't rely on this data, so it's really meant as a kind of a first step or something to get you thinking in the right way. But it's not definitive, not the end of it. So this is the CCBI, and this is the baseline. So it's kind of taking that data we just looked at and putting it into priorities. But these are the priorities prior to any practices we've done. And then finally, we have the surface. Well, we have the priority fields, CCBI priority fields. These are the current priorities. So looking at all the practices we have already done, you can see between these, it's the same area, but the priorities have kind of gone down the list. So the priority ones would be the ones that are most in need of treatment. The priority 4s, the dark blue color, are ones that we've already done a lot of practices on. And specifically, we've done avoid, control, and trap practices. So every practice that we do that treats these concerns is designated as an avoid, control, or trap practice. And in this layer, you can actually identify one of the fields, and it'll give you the list of practices, and it'll have this ACT list part where it says, based on the practices that we have done avoid and control. There hasn't been a trap practice on that field. And so that would be maybe something to start thinking about, as potentially there's potential on that field to benefit from a trap practice. So that's where this is all coming from. Now, this data can't be shared outside the agency because, or at least outside of, who we have agreements with to share it with, because it has the practice data in it, and so that is protected information between the producers and us. But we do have generalized maps of the whole state here that we can share with anybody. So the SVI data, this is what it looks like when you map it over the whole state. And it is split between the surface, subsurface, and subsurface undrained. The CCBI, now, in order to protect the privacy of the producers, we did this map is kind of generalized it by the watershed. And so within a watershed, within each Huck 12 watershed here, we're kind of seeing, they're split between high remaining and low remaining. So areas that had a lot of the red SVI versus areas that had less, and then high treated and low treated. So areas that we've done a lot of these ACT practices and areas that we haven't. And so this is something that could be used on kind of a macro level to identify where in your county is maybe the area that would benefit the most from some outreach. But yeah, unfortunately, that field level data for the CCBI is internal. But this map we can share with absolutely anybody. So that's what we have available. And it is again split between surface, subsurface, and subsurface undrained. There's a lot more data out there, but I think these layers they have a lot of potential to help with the avoid control trap specifically, and it is something that I think we've maybe not taken super great advantage of in the past. A lot of work went into making this data, and yeah, I think it's got a lot of potential to be helpful. So that's all I got for now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Tony. Thank you. This is Mark Goodson, and I'm going to follow up Dan and Tony's talk with a presentation here. Let me push the button so we get things in order here. Did I push that button? And I need to push this button here. There we go. Planning ACT conservation systems is the name of my topic here, and it's ACT, avoid, control, and trap conservation systems. So we've heard from Dan and we've heard from Tony that we really need to be planning our conservation to a systems approach, and this avoid, control, and trap has been proposed by conservation leaders across the country to deal with the pollution problems, the water quality problems that we have associated with cropland agriculture. But these principles also fit with headquarters, with pasture land. And so, I'm going to be using cropland examples because I'm the cropland specialist, but these things are applicable. Think of this ACT as a template for thinking about things. What does ACT stand for? Avoid, control, and trap. And here's a list over here on the left. These are from the SEEP and from the SEEP data that Tony was showing, and the SVI and the CCBI. It's a list of all of many of our practices, and it lists whether they're practices that avoid polluting, that control the pollution, or that trap the pollutants. And so these fit together. It takes all three to make a clean conservation system so that we can get to our goals. Avoid, control, and trap. Pretty simple to remember. Okay, let's dive in and see a little bit closer. We're talking about avoiding, that's preventing pollutants from forming in the first place. Wow, think of that. Prevent them from forming. Okay, so this is a very important step, and we don't think about it. It has a lot of challenges to dealing with, but our systems are making pollutants. We're making the pollutants. I mean, the society is large farming. And how can we avoid that? And I think that's a great important step. And we can't really avoid it 100% across the board because we're in an erosive environment here, and you can see the evidence of it in our landscapes that we've got a lot of rainfall. And that moves the pollutants. And so, how can we minimize those losses? How can we minimize the transport of those pollutants so that they don't reach the streams? And we have techniques that can do that with our practices. And finally, we need to trap those nutrients that escape our control efforts, and that's to safeguard sensitive areas to protect our water, and so we can trap whatever loose pollutants are out there before they get into the water. So that's our ACT system. Wow, look at this. This is a problem, and what's causing this is not a single. There's not a single cause causing this kind of water pollution. but actually a number of causes. And that's where the systems approach comes in, because as Dan pointed out, each one of these resource concerns can be dealt with by a combination of practices, and the right practices are going to depend on the landscape, the farm, that recipe you come up with, and including the farmer, that we know that the farmer is able to execute the plans that we propose. But we're really after, sediment, our number one water pollution contaminant, and nitrogen and phosphorus are coming along for it. So let's get right into it. Avoiding pollutants. We're going to try to prevent pollutants from forming. Wow. So if we produce less pollutants, we'll have less to control and less to trap. Here's our number one problem, as far as I'm concerned, is this raindrop impact on the soil surface and the splashing of the sediment. This is where the sediment comes from. This is the creating of the pollutant. This is forming the pollutant. Every time this raindrop hits, it hits bare soil, it's shattering the aggregates that help the soil to infiltrate water when it comes in. This is loosening up and creating a load of sediment. Some of that sediment, if you look in the lower right-hand corner here, you can see that it can throw those sediment particles up to 1.5 meters away from one raindrop. It's pretty amazing. And look at the number of raindrops in a 1-inch storm has 33 billion raindrops. So we've got this action going on. This is at the real close up level. We've got 33 billion of these hitting an acre in a 1-inch rainstorm. That's a lot of action. That's a lot of power, and we're creating a whole load of sediment that way. And here's our diagram. We're going to come back to this cartoon a couple times. Here's our raindrop impact, and it's pitting out the soil. It's pitting out the soil. Some of this sediment is landing locally. They call that local deposition. Some of it's getting swept up with the runoff water. And there's going to be runoff in our environment. We can't stop that, because we've got more rainfall than the soils can absorb. But we make things worse, and we'll talk about that by allowing this kind of erosion. So there's a whole sediment load that's going with the runoff water, and here it is getting deposited. And this load is getting deposited somewhere, and too often this is our final destination, is in our rivers, streams, and other waterways. Okay, and then on top of all that, we've got this manure spreader who's spreading N, P, and K on the surface of the soil. Okay, and those pollutants are mixing in with this runoff water and this sediment, and causing a real problem with the water. Here's what our fields look like after they've been scoured by raindrops. Notice something here about this picture. There's no vegetation, and I want to say something about vegetation. Is long-term vegetation is always your friend. You heard Dan say that with his talk on systems. And I'd say long-term vegetation would be an intense crop rotation that includes cover crops and includes winter crops. It is, and have something continuously growing there, a root in the soil year round. Okay, so long-term vegetation is always your friend. Here's a statement that says it a little bit differently. I just pointed out that erosion is causing the sediment to load up, and making our big loads of pollution. The greatest deterrent to soil erosion by water is the vegetative cover, both living and dead, on the soil surface. So plants and the dead body of plants are the greatest deterrent of soil erosion when they're on the soil surface. And some of you might remember this slogan from a few years ago: soil is meant to be covered. Soil is meant to be covered. So here's your take-home message. And I will point out this first statement: greatest deterrent to soil erosion by water is vegetative cover, is from the NRCS National Agronomy Manual. So that's a pretty bold statement. Long-term vegetation is always your friend. Here are the things we can do is to choose practices that cover the soil. You choose practices that disturb the soil surface less and maintain residue on the surface. Have intense rotations so we've got something growing out there. When we don't have a crop to grow, if we've got a hole, it's to put a cover crop in there. That's an example of a sweep to help avoid producing these pollutants. Next, we've got pollutants that are getting loose in the field and leaving the field, in the runoff water. Our job is to minimize those losses, to minimize the transport of those, and to control those. Okay, here's our commercial again for the avoid the raindrop impact, control the runoff. This runoff is doing a lot of damage to the soil surface, and that's here's what's happening. When those sediments settle down on the surface of the soil, some of them just sink right down, some of them get into the runoff. The ones that settle down locally and along the slope and it form a crust in the surface of the soil. This is like an impermeable shingle over the surface of the soil, which actually expresses the runoff and increases the amount that's running off, because it really damages the infiltration of the water into the soil particles, because we're destroying soil aggregates. This is our 33 billion raindrops again. This is what they leave behind. They leave behind a crust that's impermeable, that increases runoff and decreases infiltration. And look what it does. This is everywhere this water it runs off. It's because it forms puddles, and you've all seen it. This is the uncontrolled runoff that's making its way down to the gutter, down to the stream, down to the river. And the soil surface that it's leaving behind is just like rough sandpaper. It doesn't have any holes in it. And what can we do about those things? We've got practices. These are a few of our control practices. Grass waterway. If we need a grass waterway, let's get one in there functioning properly and use this full long-term vegetation. That's always your friend. Other practices we talked about already today: contour farming. These are ways of slowing down the water so that sediment drops out. Same with strip cropping. Slows down the water, sediment drops out, and it controls or reduces the amount of pollutants that get downhill into the ditches. Take-home message: greatest deterrent to soil erosion by water is the vegetative cover, living or dead, on the soil surface. Soil is meant to be covered. Long-term vegetation, always your friend. So I want you to think of that long-term vegetation as growing on the crop field with your intense crop rotations. Finally, we need to trap pollutants, safeguard sensitive areas. Okay, we're in an erosive situation. We're going to have runoff. We're going to try to minimize the pollutants in that runoff, but as that runoff accelerates and builds and adds to the concentrated flow, it's going to be a chore for us to sort out these sediments, and so that the water that enters our waterways, runoff water that enters our waterways, is clean and acceptable. So we've got to deal with this load now that ends up there, and too many times our runoff is uncontrolled and runs right into a concentrated flow eventually downstream before it gets to the final concentrated flow of the river or the stream. So this is our problem we've got to deal with. Okay, it's important to notice that the problem isn't at this location. The problem is upstream. In the upper right-hand corner, we can see there's no permanent vegetation. There's no long-term vegetation. There are no plants. Actually, we should just talk about it. Long-term plants fix the soils. Plants improve the soil health. Plants help to maintain the dynamic properties that we want to achieve in the soil. So because there are no plants, we're having this sediment load working its way with the runoff. It's settling into the soil surface. It's forming an impermeable surface. And here we go. We've got runoff water full of nutrients, full of sediment escaping. Again, long-term vegetation is our friend. Here's our filter strips that help to decrease the amount of sediment. There's sediment deposition in these full-time permanent cover practices. And here are some other practices. A field border. Water will hit that in the runoff, will drop out the sediment, and water will pass through that buffer area and infiltration will take place. And so we've got that filtering going on. These are the trapping practices. So what I'm showing you with this avoid, control, and trap is that you can mix and match the conservation practices to avoid, control, and trap the pollutants. And they need to be used in a suite. And your job as a planner is working on the landscape, seeing what the need is, then working with the producer to find a satisfactory alternative that can be implemented. But again, the greatest deterrent of soil erosion by water is the vegetative cover, living or dead, on the soil surface. I want you to remember that. Now here is our slide again. ACT, avoid, control, and trap. But I emphasize here it's avoid and controlling practices and trapping practices. This is not an either or. We can't put a buffer by the stream and expect that's going to do a job of protecting us. We need to reduce this soil load. These raindrops, 33 billion in a storm, are creating more and more and more pollutants. And because we're putting nutrients on the surface of the soil, the increased runoff that they're causing, the damage to the soil, is making things worse and worse for us. So we really need to work on that. But we need all three of these types of practices for our ACT system. Another way you could look at this, if you want to talk about a system, you could call it the PMS system. It's to prevent pollutants from forming, minimize the losses of transported pollutants, and safeguarding sensitive areas. There's our PMS system. Another system that I've mentioned is our soil health system. And if you've been through soil health training, or you will be shortly, or what you've learned about it, we have these principles of soil health that tell us to minimize the disturbance, to maximize living roots in the soil, to cover the soil. If we'd follow these soil health system principles, we would go a long way to reducing and avoiding the amount of sediment and nutrients being produced. And finally, the last system I'll mention here is the nutrient management 4Rs. There's a lot of improvements that can be made to the efficiency use of fertilizers and nutrients that are applied to the soil. Way too many of the soil nutrients, the nutrients that plants need, are being lost to runoff, being lost to gaseous losses, being lost to leaching. We need to really practice the 4Rs to avoid those nutrients forming in the first place. And the way to prevent them from forming is to put the nutrients in from the right source at the right rate, at the right time, in the right place. And we build a lot of new manure storages with 6 months capacity, and a lot of manure is going on the ground after crops are taken off in the late summer. And I tell you, if there's no vegetation, if there are no plants, if there's no long-term vegetation, if there's not a living root in the ground and the soil's not covered, you can't tell me that putting that manure surface applying on the ground is the right place at the right time. It's not the right thing to do. So we really need to get vegetation, uh, long-term vegetation, permanent vegetation, continuous vegetation growing in these crop fields as much as possible, or we're going to be fighting a losing battle. Okay, and with that, I've reached the end of my talk this morning, and I appreciate your attention. We'll be talking more about the avoid, control, and trap practices in the agronomy week here. Let me figure out which button to push here.
Thanks a lot, Mark.
Very good.
We appreciate that. A good message for me as an engineer. I love to jump right to the bigger engineering prescriptions for addressing resource concerns or inadequate practices, and that's not often appropriate or the right thing to do or the most efficient thing to do or the most economic thing to do. So a good message all around. With that, we're going to shift gears and we're going to go to our next presentation, which is on the CPA 52 and how we document some of this. So our next presenter is Diana Barnes. She's a resource conservationist with NRCS out of the state office in Harrisburg. So Diana, it's all yours.
Thanks, Tim. Trying to share my screen here quick.
Okay, we can see it.
Awesome. Thank you. Like Tim said, I'm Diana Barnes. I'm a resource conservationist in the state office. A lot of you may know me because you're probably here to get your certification, your certified planner certification. And if you don't, you will probably be meeting soon, probably at CP2 or upcoming trainings. So great talk from Dan and Mark, and great way to follow with the CPA 52 or the environmental evaluation worksheet. Here's where you're going to be documenting all these great systems or practices and the resource concerns that are out there at the farm. So let's get started. So what are your responsibilities as far as the CPA 52 and filling this document out? You're going to be documenting the existing resource concerns. We're going to display and evaluate the effects of various conservation options, just like Mark and Dan talked about. So these systems is where you're going to be documenting these alternatives in the CPA 52. And then you're also going to be estimating and recording the effect of those practices. And what they have on the resource concerned. And finally, complying with NEPA. We know that there's a lot of policy and laws out there that we need to comply with. So this is a form that will help you document those also. So the 52 is located in section 3 of the Field Tech Guide. And in there are some examples. There are some templates and one that includes guide sheets that help you fill out the special environmental concerns at the end. So if you need a blank 52, that's where you're going to find it. And you're also going to find an example that's filled out so that you can kind of follow. So here we have the CPA 52. This is what the example looks like, and I'm going to be using this one for today's training. So first things first, we want to fill out the top part, right? We want to fill out the client name. What is this for? Is this for a CTA plan? Is this for a EQIP contract or CPP contract? And so on. We want to make sure we document that here. Also, we want to document the farm and tract number, the fields that you're going to be evaluating, and then we want to know the land uses. So you're going to separate them as crop, pasture, farmstead, forest, and so on. and making sure you're putting the fields there. That way, it's clear which ones are you're evaluating. Usually we utilize one CPA 52 per land unit. But if you're doing a system where it includes nutrient management, and let's say there's 2 tracks, and that one track only includes like one field or something like that, it's not going to be too complicated or too overwhelming to include it in here. Well, then that's fine. But if not, usually try to use one per farm. Okay, so the need for action. Here's where you're gonna document what's being addressed by this plan and why is NRCS working with this client, right? And you're gonna see that throughout the presentation, I'm gonna be referencing to the 9 steps of planning, because this form helps you document the 9 steps as well. So this is a form that you should be utilizing from, that first visit, and start filling it out. That way, by the end of, the planning process, you have this completed. So, for example, this will be step 1, right? What's step 1 of the planning process? Identifying problems and opportunities. So here's where you're going to be documenting that. And you should be documenting, what are the research concerns the practice or the plan is going to be addressing. So not just mentioning what's the need for action, updating a conservation plan. No, you want to go further than that and say, which research concerns you're going to be addressing. And then we move on to the client's objectives. So what is the purpose? Like, why is the producer working with NRCS, and what are their goals? So that's what you want to put here. And again, this will be step 2. So step 2 of the planning process is determining objectives. So here's where you're going to be recording that. Why are we working with that person, and what are their goals? So for example, in this one, it says maintain barnyard area and improve grazing system, increase production and convert to a no-till cropping system, improve wildlife habitat. So that's what we're going to be working with him. So that's what we're going to put there. Okay. Moving on. So in the benchmark condition, we want to be identifying the present condition of the planning area. So what are the research concerns? What is happening there now? So you're going to document that existing condition, and this needs to be documented. This is required now. In the past, we used to write in the no action column, benchmark equals no action. That is not acceptable anymore. The benchmark condition needs to be documented. So this column has to be filled out, and we need to be documenting what is the benchmark condition for each of the research concerns and the special environmental concerns. And this will be step 3. So, we're inventorying the resources, and here's where you're going to be documenting that. So, for example, here we have, rotation exceeds T. For a crop, for pasture, it meets planning criteria, and no issues observed for the farmstead. And if you're going to be using C, P, or F, for each of the land uses, so for crop, you're going to be using C, for P, you're going to be using pasture. Make sure you keep that consistent throughout the form then. If not, I would recommend not using that at all and just making it a general. But if you're going to be using that, and it is helpful, but just make sure you use it throughout. Okay, and moving on, then we have the no action column. Here's where you're going to be documenting what happens if we don't do anything, right? Like if we're not addressing that research concern, what's going to happen? Is the research concern going to remain? Is it going to increase? What's going on? So, and again, referencing the 9 steps, this is analyzing that resource data. So we're analyzing what's going to happen at the no action stage if nothing is done with that resource concerned. So for example, here for the sheet and rail erosion, we knew that it exceeds T, and then we document that it's going to remain or increase if we don't do anything, right? Okay. And then here's where we're gonna document those alternatives. So we heard Dan talking about the RMS systems and then or RMS level. So here's where we're gonna be documenting that. I should mention that RMS option is not required for the 52 anymore, but it's a way to document that. So I highly suggest that you document that. And then you select the, the either the progressive plan if that's what the farmer has accepted to go with, or that's his preference. But it's nice to see that RMS alternative being documented in the 52. So for example here, we can see that we do not meet planning criteria. So just kind of making sure you guys understand that that box should be checked if we are not meeting planning criteria, meaning we're not addressing that resource concern. And then we move on to which is going to be our alternative in this plan. For the progressive plan, it's going to be alternative 2. Here we are documenting that we are going to be reducing that soil erosion to T, so then we don't check that not PC box because we are meeting planning criteria. And then at the top here, you could see that we're documenting that alternative 1 is going to be the same as alternative 2 unless noted. So our RMS option is going to be the same for this resource concerned, and that's why there's nothing noted in there. In the case that we are doing something, then you would see that it's going to be documented there. And then always we're going to reference the plan at the top with the date. So here to provide some examples, and I think I already mentioned this one. We were not meeting, so we're checking the not PC box, and then we're meeting, so we're not checking that box. And then this brings us to step 6. We're going to be evaluating those alternatives. So here's where we're going to be evaluating the alternatives that we have documented. Another example, so yeah, we're meeting PC. There's no issues with gully erosion, so no gully erosion observed. That's what we're going to be documenting in the benchmark condition. So meets planning criteria, the box is not checked. And it meets planning criteria for alternative 2, box is not checked. Now this one is one that I always kind of see people miss this one because a lot of farmers are not interested in working with wildlife habitat. So we can see here that there is an inadequate cover throughout the year due to cropping practices and unsafe grazing. So we are not meeting planning criteria for the wildlife, and you should be also referencing the wildlife habitat evaluation worksheet, so the WAG in here. And then, so we're not meeting planning criteria, right? And then we're moving on to alternative 2, which is a progressive progressive plan column. There is no change. The farmer does not wish to address this at this time, so we're just going to document there's no change. Planning criteria is not met, and we are checking that box. So if you see, we're checking both boxes for the no action column and the alternative 1. And then we're going to move on to our RMS column, and we are going to be documenting what will meet for that option. So here we are meeting that option. Wildlife cover increased throughout buffer established. So we're recommending that a buffer should be established to increase that wildlife habitat. And we are referencing the WAG, saying that that would meet because it would be higher than 0.5. And then we are not checking that PC box because we are meeting planning criteria. So this is just an example of how to document both alternatives in the CPA 52. So here you should always be referencing if the track is not or is located in a PM 2.5 county, or if it's not, and what are the potential concerns here. So if we're not, then we should be checking that box. And then there is a list, and I think Dan mentioned this, that references which practices have benefits pertaining like greenhouses, gases, and things like that. So we have a list of those practices, and we can reference them here if we're planning them to reduce these gases. And I'm not going through all the resource concerns, just kind of providing an example on how to fill the document out. So here, just kind of referencing the plant degraded condition. Here, you should remember that the PCS has effect on all of these. So when you're addressing the pasture, you should be considering that the PCS can affect this. So you should be referencing the PCS in here, and we will be talking more about that in CP2 training, pertaining like planning criteria. So if you're not meeting planning criteria, that's the PCS is the tool that you utilize for pasture to address these resource concerns. So just make sure you're taking a look at that. Okay, the human and economic and social considerations. Here, a lot of the times we just say omit due to sensitive information for the public health and safety. And then we're just gonna document what are we gonna doing for the land use. So we're just gonna continue for the ag use, so no change there. And same thing for the other ones. Okay, here's where we go in the special environmental concerns. Like I said, we do have to document the benchmark condition for this as well. For all of these, there are layers out there, so you can contact either Tony or Marcy if you're using desktop, because we have layers for most of these. And if you do not have access, either way, you can contact Marcy, and maybe she might be able to share like the ArcMaps layers for you to be able to utilize. Or if not, like I mentioned, the guide sheets are in section 3 of the field office technical guide that can help you fill this out. Or there's websites and things like that that you can find this information available for you to be able to utilize this. There is a drop down when you see the may affect or no effect. That is a drop down that you can just drop and select if it's going to be affecting or no affecting this special environmental concerns. So we see that we have, the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Coastal Zone. Some of these are not applicable to us, like the coral reef that does not exist in Pennsylvania. So you can just leave that as an NA. And just to provide an example here, so this is some of the guidance that we have for the Clean Water Air Act. Just, if is there going to be a permit required or not? Are we going to be affecting that stream? Is it a 303 the stream? So just making sure that we are addressing and referencing here, are there going to be potential impacts or not? Is it going to affect or not? Making sure we are looking into each one of these. For the cultural resources, I'm assuming most of you have taken the cultural resources training. If not, there will be another one coming up in the fall, but you can contact Christopher Plant for this. And here's where you're going to be documenting if there's no impacts, and reference the cultural resources worksheet, if Christopher has signed it or not, and you can just document that here.
Deanna, did we lose you? I think you might be muted.
Oh, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep, hear you now.
Oh, okay. I don't know what happened. Okay, I was saying that for the endangered and threatened species, here's where you be documenting the PNDI process. So when you complete the PNDI, you're gonna reference here, if there was a hit or if there wasn't, was there an avoidance measure, but the farmer signed it. We contacted DCNR. Was there bog turtle phase 1 completed, things like that. You should record here to make sure that we're clear on that, and then we can move on with the project. And that what's going on. Okay. Environmental justice, like I said, there are layers for some of these, just to kind of reference that, there's a layer for that one, but that, it should be identified. Most of the times there's no issues there. Invasive species, there is, we have a list of the invasive species in Pennsylvania. So here's where you can mention if we're going to be treating some of that. So for example, here, it says that producer manages ginseng weed and Johnson grass, and then they're being specific on crop, pasture, and farmstead. So that's great there. And then we're saying that there's no effect because they will continue to control this invasive species. Riparian area, is there a stream? Is there not a stream? Here's where we can do like not applicable if we don't have a stream, but we should be documenting all that here. As far as Dan was saying, a lot of time we do recommend we leave a riparian area and things like that, just for that systems approach practice that benefits that. So are we gonna be fencing out the stream, things like that? That should be documented in our alternative 1 column. Wetlands. So here we're gonna follow our wetland review process. Here's where we document, there was a 1026 submitted, there was a wetland determination completed. We're not gonna be draining or filling, wetlands and things like that. So planned actions will maintain vegetative cover. That's what you want to document. Make sure you always say if there is or not a wetland determination, even though we should be having or collecting one for our if we're going to be installing any practices in the farm. So again, follow the wetland review process for this one. Wildlife and scenic rivers, here's just an example of, there are layers up there, there are maps up there. This one's one that we sometimes assume there is not a scenic river in the plant or in the farm, but here we can see that there are some designated scenic rivers in Pennsylvania. Some are federal ones and some are state ones, but there are some, so you can utilize this map, or I'm assuming there's a layer out there as well to document this. Okay, and then here at the end is where you're gonna be pretty much selecting the preferred alternative. Well, I guess before that, here's where we're gonna be documenting, are there any easements or do we need any permits and things like that in the farm for the no action column, for that first block there, and if we contacted any agencies. For the cumulative effects, this is something that I was kind of, when I'm reviewing plans, people leave in blank. Here you should be documenting, what research or which research concerns are going to continue if we are not doing anything. So pretty much the research concerns that are present. So if we have erosion, sheet and rail, we're going to be documenting that here. Stream bank erosion, we're going to be documenting that here. So whatever research concerns are present, and if we don't address them, they're going to continue. And then in that same line for all the alternative that we are working with, what research concerns are going to continue if we don't address them? So here a lot of times I see none, and there are some that we are not addressing. So existing and planned practices in local watershed will community improve all research concern except. So it says they're all, and here a lot of times we're going to be mentioning wildlife. Like the producer is going to be addressing all of the research concerns except wildlife. And that's where it should be noted there. The ones that we are not addressing. in that selected alternatives. So as you see here, there is a check mark in the preferred alternative. So the producer has agreed to implement planned when NRCS financial system becomes available for that progressive planned. And he's not interested in implementing the RMS option that we had in this EE form. So that's where we're going to be selecting the alternative 2. Section N here, I always see this in blank too. We should be mentioning like the local stream, creek, and watershed here in this section. Section O, here's where the individual that completed this form is going to be signing. But keep in mind that you can only sign this form if you've completed at a minimum Intro to Conservation Planning and the environmental evaluation webinar series that's available in LagLearn. So if you completed Intro to Planning and the environmental evaluation webinar series, you can sign section O. So if you're qualified, for signing, then you can go ahead and sign this section. Oh, and going back to the 9 steps. So here's like step 7. Here's where we're gonna be making that decision, right? So the farmer made the decision that he was gonna be implementing the progressive plan alternative 2. Section Q here. This only can be signed by the RFO, and the RFOs are designated to be the district conservationist or supervisor district conservationist. So they're the only ones that can be signing this form, and they will be selecting, the finding, if this is for a CTA plan or if this is for a contract. So if it's for a CTA plan, we're going to be selecting finding number 1. It is not a federal action. If it is for a contract, EQIP, RCPP, and so on, then they should be selecting number 3. It is a federal action. And then there's other things that could be applicable here, like categorical exclusions, but this is a little bit more complicated. So we will go into this for at CP2 training in September. But for now, this is just for DCs and SDCs that can sign this form. So just as a summary, use action words like enhance, improve, reduce when we're, referencing that we're doing something to address that resource concerns. Or increase, decrease, converted, and compliance, compatible with management plan. NA. Be careful with NA. I see NA a lot, and not applicable means it's not applicable. We should be assessing all the resource concerns. Sometimes I see NA for like wildlife or forest, and there is forest in the farm. So it is applicable. You can then say, nothing observed or no change or meets planning criteria or meets BC. Keywords like that. But be careful when using NA because some things are applicable, and I'm seeing NA in the resource concern is not being addressed or looked at all. Do not use significant unless it actually applies. Quantify whenever possible. So mention acres, tons, hours, and things like that. But keep it brief. Sometimes I see like paragraphs in these alternatives. And yes, we should be mentioning, which practices are going to be addressing the research concern so that we're showing the effect and that is in fact going to meet planning criteria. But try and keep it brief. The EE worksheet should be, or it must be completed for our NRCS conservation plans, even CTA. So yes, the EE must be completed for all plans. All sections should be completed. the benchmark condition needs to be documented. We talked about that. The benchmark condition in the past was not required, but now it is. So keep that in mind, that the benchmark condition needs to be documented throughout the EE. So not just the resource concerns, but also the special environmental concerns. It must be signed and dated by a qualified person. So we talked about the RFO. So that first section, the planner usually can sign it if they completed the trainings that they need. And then the second section with the RFO designated person. So both blocks need to be signed. The finding, yeah, we just talked about that. The findings need to be signed by the NRCS RFO. And then just also remember, when a conservation plan is revised, the EE worksheet needs to be updated. So make the necessary changes to the EE to make sure that it makes sense with the plan. So if something was updated in the plan, it should be updated in the EE. And then also always keep in mind that all documents should match. So like, we're looking at the tools that you're using to assess this resource concern. So like, I'm talking about Russell, the grazing plan, the PCS, and documents like that. They should all match. So if if you're exceeding T, that should be documented in the plan, and then erosion shouldn't be meeting planning criteria because you're not meeting T. Same with the PCS. Most of the resource concerns, to be able to meet planning criteria, you need to have a 4 or higher score in the PCS. So if you have 3s, 2s, and your scores in the PCS, make sure you are addressing that. And in the EE, you're saying it doesn't meet planning criteria because your score is below 4. And this was just kind of like an overview of how to fill it out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. Like I said, there is a example in the Field Office Technical Guide, and we will go in deeper with this at our upcoming training, or CP2 training at September. So if you have any questions.
No questions in the chat, Diana.
Okay.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. We're going to we're slightly behind, so let's go with a 10-minute break. Let's be back at 10:07, and I will start a clock here and get that going. So I will see everybody back. Stretch your legs, get some coffee, pancakes, whatever, and we'll see you at 10:07. All right, welcome back. Let's get in the chat and tell me what you did for breakfast today to get everybody back in and back into the groove of meetings. So tell me what you had for breakfast in the anybody. Did anybody eat breakfast? There we go, a sandwich. Wow. Granola, jelly beans, and peanut butter cup. Somebody had the Easter Bunny visit, I can tell. Eggs, yogurt, very good. Excellent, excellent. Very good. Well, we're going to move on to our next presentation. And I think I saw Justin Challenger on already. Justin, are you ready to present, or would you like me to start with Jared Shippey? What was that?
You hear me?
Yep, I hear you. Yep, what was that?
Awesome. Yeah, I'm ready. Let me see if I can.
Okay,
Screen
sounds
up
good.
here.
Well, we're gonna kick off our intro to financial assistance talk with Justin Challenger, and Justin is the Director of Financial and Technical Assistance at the State Conservation Commission. And I think you started in that position probably a little bit less than a year ago. So, Justin, whenever you're ready, go ahead and share your presentation.
Getting there right now. Yep, this will work.
I see it.
When I hit share, for some reason, it keeps popping up on the other screen. Let's try that.
Yeah, now I see your desktop.
Hold on. How about that?
Looks good. Perfect.
All right. So, yeah, as Tim said, I'm Justin Challenger, Director of Financial and Technical Assistance Programs at the Commission. I've been in this role for a cozy 6 months now. My predecessor left in July of last year, right about the time ACAP, if you guys are familiar, that became a thing. There was a little bit of gap till I came on in October, and I've been drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, for the last 6 months. So I'm going to go over the financial assistance programs we have here at the SCC. If you guys have any questions or comments or want me to dive into anything in more detail that I talk about, by all means, just interrupt me, raise your hand or whatever. Just get my attention so I know to stop. I have a tendency to just motor through these things. So again, if you need me to slow down or talk about anything else in detail, please let me know. Tim, do I have any time? What's my time constraints here?
You have about half an hour.
Oh, perfect. Run through this in that time. I'll leave a bunch of time at the end too, hopefully for questions or any comments then too. So, but again, feel free to interrupt me as I go. So we have 4 main programs here at the Commission, and you'll hear a lot of these, like people say REAP, CEG, ACAP, AgriLink, and they all, they're all acronyms. We, like most entities, we run on acronyms a lot, but I'm going to talk about these 4 programs today, and I'll go into detail here about each one of them and what they do. So REAP is the Resource Enhancement and Protection Program, and REAP is a tax credit program, which is kind of different than most conservation programs out there. Most programs we have are grant programs. This is actually a tax credit that farmers can get. It's a first come, first serve program that helps farmers and landowners earn tax credit, and that's to offset the cost of conservation. Those tax credits are provided through the Department of Treasury for implementing best management practices on their farms that protect water quality. Right, that's really what we're after here. This program is administered at the Commission. It's not administered through conservation districts like a lot of other programs are. Like CEG and ACAP, we'll talk about, those are kind of delegated to the districts. REAP is administered by Joel Semke here at the SEC. There's 13 million available annually that's dedicated to the program, and that's again comes to serve. There's a link to our website. I think Tim will send this. I'll get this to you, Tim, after we're done, and then you can ship it out to everyone.
We'll post it on the website. Sounds good. Thanks.
Yep. Again, REAP allows farmers to get earned tax credits, and we want them to be implementing best management practices. But one of the other cool things REAP does is they can get tax credits for purchasing conservation equipment, which is rare, really, in the grant reimbursement area. So, financial assistance type stuff is rare to have equipment included. So, no-till equipment is what jumps to the top of my mind there. So, if a farmer would purchase a no-till drill, he could apply for tax credits for it. And also costs for developing plans, right? Manure management, Ag E&S, conservation plans, those all qualify for tax credits. It is broken down into different categories for how much they're eligible for reimbursement. And it varies from 25 to 90% based on different criteria. There's a 50% reimbursement criteria for no-till planting equipment, precision nutrient stuff, cover crops, grazing, that kind of thing. It bumps up to 75% when you really get into those more Cadillac type things, like animal concentration areas, that kind of thing. And also the planning is included in that 75% reimbursement category. There is a category for up to 90% for very specific TMDL watersheds, and that's for multi-species cover crops, riparian buffers, forest buffers, livestock exclusion. Those are eligible at 90% reimbursement. The thing to keep in mind with the REAP, it's only on out-of-pocket costs that the farmer can get. So if we'll get into this, but if there's an ACAP project that would cover 90% of the farmer's cost, that 10% that's left to his out-of-pocket cost, those would be what he's eligible for, not the entire 100%. They can't double dip, so to speak, only on their actual out-of-pocket. Again, those eligible costs: planning, materials, labor, post-construction expenses, and then 1 year of interest payments if they have a loan. Again, it's first come, first serve, and they're accepted. Applications are accepted until all the tax credits are exhausted, which at this point they are all exhausted for 23. I'll get there. Again, the tax credits are issued after the installation of the practice or the purchase of their equipment. And like I said, any cost share portions from the state or federal portions of that are falling out. There is a REAP sponsorship program, which, to be honest with you, I don't understand completely. Joel knows that. Joel Semke from our office gets that inside out. It gets super complicated. There's something like a business can sponsor a project and apply for the tax credit instead of the ag operation. And there's something, I know Sheets is a big sponsor of that, and Sheets dedicates, I think, $1 million a year or something to do that. But there's somehow with accounting and tax credits that they can finagle it and make it beneficial to both the farmer and the sheep. So there are some of those out there. A key thing is accountants can really advise farmers on what they should be doing with it. Farmer can sell their tax credits. That's a way to gain actual cash out of it if they don't have a lot of income tax liability. And there are brokers out there that'll help handle that sale. And again, as of I think earlier this year, Joel said all the REAP funding was allocated, and they're not accepting any. We're not accepting any more applications this year. The next round will open in July of 23. So important to know here with REAP is that if you have questions, contact Joel Semke at our office, and his email address is there. The next program is AgriLink. AgriLink is actually a loan program, and what it does is it gives low interest loans to ag operations for implementing BMPs. Okay, so those BMPs have to be included in some type of plan, which will come up here frequently with these discussions on mission-related programs. We really want to drive those plans and getting proper planning in place, and then funding the BMPs that are on there. AgriLink is administered by PA Treasury in collaboration with us here at the Commission. Eric Cromer from my office is the one who handles the day-to-day of this. There is $25 million total available, and that's released in $2.5 million blocks. I don't believe we're anywhere close to that $2.5 million right now. It's not, the AgriLink isn't heavily utilized at this point, but it might become more popular in the future. What AgriLink will do is they'll use commission funds to subsidize the interest rate. So if a farmer has $20,000 out of pocket and he wants to get a loan for that $20,000, he can get it through any commercially available lender. I think Farm Credit Service is a big one. He can get that an interest, or he can get a loan through them. And say the interest rate is 6%, which is kind of a common interest rate right now. The commission will pay 3% of that interest rate on that loan. So then his interest rate is really effectively, makes it more palatable for the farmer to be able to do an BMP. There is a laundry list of eligible uses, as you can see there. Most of it's directly tied to BMPs or some type of plan. If you have any questions about actual BMPs or eligible uses of AgriLink, again, have them contact Eric Cromer here. Key thing here, $250,000 is the maximum amount of loan, and it can't be more than 12 years. Okay, so hopefully there's no case out there where a farmer has to borrow that much money. Hopefully we've got other programs that will help cover that cost, but if he does, there's some money out there that will help his interest rate. Again, there's a link to our website. Finn said they'll post it. Feel free to click it and check out. If you Google PA State Conservation Commission, it'll take you to our webpage, and then all our sub-programs are listed on there. That's really the easiest way, and actually that's normally how I get to our website. If you have any questions, contact Eric. So these last two programs I'll talk about, I'll spend most of the time on ACAP, which is kind of the most popular right now. CEG is growing as well, but ACAP seems to be the hot button topic. I'll spend most of the time there, but CEG and ACAP are very similar. They fund similar BMPs. They have similar rules. Not all the same, but you'll see here as I walk through. They're grant programs. So what is CEG? Conservation Excellence Grant. And you'll, in meetings and everything, you'll hear CEG, you'll hear ACAP. Those are two prominent grant programs that give grant funding to farmers to implement best management practices. CEG is kind of specialized in high priority ag locations. And it's dedicated to tier 1 and tier 2 counties at this point only. But it dedicates grants to farmers to do BMP projects. It was created in 2019 as part of the PA Farm Bill to help support ag. The commission administers this program through delegation agreements with the county conservation districts for certain responsibilities. That includes reviewing, ranking, approving applications, very similar to ACAP, eligible projects, and then of course monitoring project completion. Again, this is financial and technical assistance to the counties and to farmers for best management practices in high priority locations in PA, Chesapeake Bay, Phase Strip, Phase 3 watershed implementation plan. So tier 1 counties, Lancaster and York, tier 2, Cumberland, Franklin, Bedford, Center, Lebanon. Currently it is only in those counties where CEG is eligible funding. We may be getting some more funding, and that's a big may, to dump into the CEG program. And if we do, we'll likely expand that out to tier 3 counties. But again, that is not set in stone at this point. As of right now, it's just tier 1 and tier 2 counties. Those grants are given on an actual reimbursement basis of actual costs, right? So If their anticipated costs are $100,000 and the ag operation completes that project and they only actually spend $90,000, we're only reimbursing $90,000. And it's based on an eligible application of costs submitted for an approved application. A single grant cannot hit $250,000, which is a key point there. When evaluating applications for eligible projects, there are certain criteria you have to keep in mind, and these are all based on the funding that come from the rules that come to us. It has to be priority locations as designated in the watershed implementation plan. I talked about that earlier. The BMPs have to be a priority BMP established by the commission and defined in the guidelines. So these programs all come with guidelines that go with the delegation agreement. CEG, ACAP have set guidelines. So those BMPs will be in those guidelines. The level of planning and technical assistance completed by the applicant for the project. Okay, so we have to keep that in mind. And also the extent the applicant is willing to mix a reasonable mix of grants and loans to get the project. There is a list of priority BMPs. Those are right there. If you have any questions about these, Eric Cromer is a good person. But really, it covers the big majority BMPs, right? That get the best benefit. So of course, livestock exclusion fencing is going to be on that list. That's a great way and buffer get those benefits. Those are on. If you have any BMP questions about CEG, feel free to reach out to us. We'll get you an answer. Eligible costs are design and engineering. Of course, we got to have a project. You have to have design. Most times there's engineering involved in that. Those are all eligible associated costs. Actual construction and installation, right? That can be provided by a contractor or the labor could be provided by the applicant. Either one of those are eligible reimbursement. Any equipment costs or material costs, those are also, obviously you need equipment and material to build a project. So those are eligible reimbursements. And any post-construction inspections, eligible as well. The key thing here is make sure the farmers or applicants know that if they're in one of those counties, they may apply to the conservation district for that funding. This program is delegated through a county conservation district. The best source to figure out how to get that funding is through their individual. I know I flew through those three. Any questions to this point before I dive into the big one, which is ACAP? Anything I need to touch on some more?
Nothing in the chat, Justin.
All right, I guess I'm just covering it at such great detail. All right, let's dive into ACAP. So, Agriculture Conservation Assistance Program. Hopefully, most of you have heard this term at this point and are well aware of the program, but if not, we will go through this in pretty good detail here. So, ACAP was established by the Pennsylvania budget in July of 22. So the program officially started July of 2022. And it basically what the legislature did, they dedicated $220 million of federal ARPA COVID relief money to a fund that they call the Clean Streams Fund. Okay. And what it's for is for financial and technical assistance for the implementation of BMPs on ag operations in the Commonwealth. Right? So that's a pretty simple purpose. Right? They want to fund technical assistance and implementation of BMPs on farms. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. The commission is charged with the oversight of this program, right? But we may delegate it to the county conservation district. And at this point, we have 65 signed agreements back from county conservation districts. We are tasked with implementing the program in Philadelphia, so that would be 66. And there was one district who is not gonna join the program and take the delegation. So in that county, commission staff will likely implement the program there. We also can delegate to Penn State. We are working with them right now to set up a center, technical assistance center. I think, and Jen's probably on here. Jen can talk more about the center and any aspects. If you guys have questions about that, you can answer those hopefully. So $220 million was dedicated to the Clean Streams Fund. 70% of that was dedicated directly to ACAP. So $154 million in total to ACAP. The commission also got an additional 10%, was $22 million dedicated to the Nutrient Management Fund. And that 22 million is pretty flexible too on how we can use it. So we've got quite a chunk of change coming our way over the next couple of years. So keep in mind, we at the commission have to have that 154 million fully committed to a contract by December of 2024, and it has to be out the door of all your local conservation district funds out the door by December of 2026. Every last dollar has to be spent by then. So, and that's the 22 million as well that was dedicated to nutrient management. All that money has to be spent. So we're really on tight deadlines here with this program to get the money allocated to contracts and get projects on the ground and completed in a short period of time. So, just an overview of commission duties of what we are tasked with here at the FTC. We're tasked with developing the guidelines, allocating the funds, picking a list of eligible PMPs. We're also developing training, education. We're working on technical assistance right now through the Penn State Center. We're trying to get additional engineers dedicated to county conservation districts that will kind of cover regional work, technical assistance there. We also are working on a reporting system, a GIS, standalone ACAP GIS system similar to dirt and gravel roads. Hopefully that'll be up and running here hopefully by the end of next quarter. So the districts will be ready to enter their expenses then and get things moving with that report. We also have to get a system of QA/QC, quality assurance, quality control, and program evaluations that comes directly out of the enabling legislation. Again, we can delegate certain duties to the districts, which we have done. We have to report annually to the legislature. That's a normal thing that comes with just about any grant program. They want to report on how funds are being used, right? They dedicated all this money. They want to know how the program's working, how things are going, what are the accomplishments. So you'll often be, a lot of these grant programs, there's a lot of reporting tied with these grant programs, and that really comes directly out of the legislation because they need to know what's going on, where the funds are going, how they're using it, what deliverables are out there. So doing that here soon, reporting to the legislature. We also at the commission, and this was a little thing they threw in there, that we have to carry out the program in counties where districts choose not to participate. So luckily at this point there's only one, and we'll be able to work through that pretty easily. The commission is allowed to use 4% of that 154 million for administrative purposes, and we can also use 4% for contractual services. So those two pots of funds really go together to help fund things like staff here at the commission. That will fund the center at Penn State. It'll also go to fund some NRCS engineers that we are partnering with to help with technical assistance. We're going to pay a small portion of that. And they're also, NRCS is working on, I think it's up and running at this point, the retired cadre of people. We're also going to dedicate some of those funds to that. The commission had to allocate the funds out to the participating, or all the counties, basically. And the law told us how we should do that and how we should base how much each county gets. They call that an apportionment. The apportionment criteria is directly in the legislation. It's based on ag impaired stream miles, number of crop acres, number of farms, number of livestock and poultry, and any other criteria established by the commission. I don't have to go back and look again exactly. I don't think we added any additional criteria there. I think we just went with those 4 main criteria established. I think we added, the only thing we did, we added a minimum allocation so that a district could get, and that was set at 300,000. That way, the minimum allocation wasn't so low that you couldn't really get a good project on the ground. The enabling legislation also covers what the district's duties are. And really that is the district's duties are to enter into the delegation agreement and carry out the program, right? Do the day-to-day administration of the program consistent with any guidelines developed here. We do, the guidelines do say they have to review applications within 90 days. That was set to kind of keep the program rolling, right? To get it up to speed and going and prevent a district from sitting on applications for a long time and not funding them. We really want the applications to come in and keep moving through the system to get these funds on the ground because we're on such a tight deadline. That tight deadline will come up over and over again in this program. And the federal government has let us know under no circumstances can we spend any of these funds after 2026. So every last dollar of that has to be out of the district's accounts by that date. And we'll have to report that all again to the federal government. We got to report to them quarterly to keep them up to date on what's going on. So just know that deadline's coming quickly. The districts are tasked with entering into an agreement with the applicant to get the project, right? So in order to fund a project, they have to have an application that's complete, and then the district board will approve that application and enter into a contract with the ag operation to implement that project. Very similar to the dirt and gravel road. District is attached with overseeing that design and installation process, make sure the BMPs are installed, certifying certain BMPs, verifying the completion. There may be an engineer involved there that does that final certification as well. The district has to reimburse the participants for their costs, right? That's how you get money to the farm. The districts may set up an advisory committee similar to a dirt and gravel roads quality assurance board. If a district chooses to do that, they have to have a set, like there's a set requirement of who can be on that board, and it's 1 rep from NRCS, 1 district representative, and up to 3 other local reps who are knowledgeable of ag operations and of conservation. So that's kind of set in the legislation. Districts may use the funds for a variety of things to get projects on the ground, financial and technical assistance to participants. The program, that's what the funds are for. They can also establish procedures for submissions, reviewing ranking applications, entering into agreements, and ensuring applicants comply with the BMP maintenance or any other contractual requirements. There are certain categories that the funding falls into that comes from the enabling legislation. The district has to spend money within 2 years of the receipt of the funds. Again, that's to keep the money going through the system because of those deadlines. The commission can redistribute on any unspent funds based on certain criteria that we establish here. But the 2 big spending criteria here, 6% of a district's allocation can go to administrative expenses, up to 10%, and up to 14% can go for technical assistance, technical service. And those are of like the district's administrative expenses, the district's technical assistance expenses, right? That means a minimum of 80% of the funds that are given to a conservation district must go to projects. And that's really how Dirt and Gravel Roads is set up and how ACAP was set up. And that was to try to get as much funding to the farmer or to the end guy who's putting the BMP in the ground as possible. There are some criteria in the enabling legislation that tells us what we have to consider. BMPs have to meet the goals of a CAP plan or a watershed implementation plan. The BMPs must be part of a conservation plan or an Ag E&S plan and a manure management or nutrient management plan, if applicable. That we can pay for the funding of those plans if there hasn't been one yet, but we don't want to focus funding on just planning. We prefer the funding be for the plan and the implementation of the BMPs that are in that plan. So we'd like to kind of conjoin those, maybe phase it, find a way to get the plan done and do BMPs on the ground, because really the point is to get those BMPs in. Priority is given to control of nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment. That's pretty simple. Any animal concentration areas have to be treated as part of a plan, or as part of a project. If they're untreated, have to be addressed. Proximity to surface water, drinking water, all that stuff has to be considered. And it has to meet design and construction standards established by the commission, and any other criteria established by the district and approved. But the thing to keep in mind with ACAP, it's really a local control program. We're trying to drive the day-to-day control policy oversight to the district, right? We want the county deciding the priorities for that funding. We don't want to address or put like huge blanket things from the state that might not be so specific in certain areas. We want to try to keep set guide rails, let you bounce around between that guide rail, but give you general direction on how the program should go, and then let the district decide where that funding goes. Again, the enabling legislation tells us who is eligible, and this comes right out of the law. I just copy and pasted it out of the law. An eligible applicant is any person or legal entity that has legal or financial responsibility for either one, an ag operation, or a property on which the ag operation takes. And what is an ag operation? The management of use of farming resources for production of crops, livestock, or poultry. These are the people who the funding is dedicated for. I'm gonna put the fee in. Again, I covered a lot of this stuff, but we really want to be addressing BMPs that are in plan, right? We want to be taking the plans and addressing and adding those BMPs to the how this whole thing works. And I think this is my last slide, but I got some time for questions. But the way the system will work, applications are ranked and approved by a district board, right? They can be ranked and accepted, or ranked by like the quality assurance board, and then recommended to the district board for approval. Once the district board approves it, the district can enter into an agreement with the ag operation for the funding. The district can advance up to 50% to that farmer for that project. The applicant can determine if they do the work themselves or if they need to contract out the project. If they do contract it, keep in mind that if it's over $250,000 project value, it has to be publicly bid. And if it's over $25,000, the prevailing wage kicks in on that contract. That is the end of my financial assistance talk. Any questions or anything you'd like me to dive into, by all means, let me know.
Great, thanks, Justin. I appreciate it. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. It's a good overview and exciting times with all of the financial assistance coming to conservation. And with that, we'll segue over to Jared Shippey. So thank you, Justin. And Jared's gonna talk about some of the NRCS funding opportunities, and Justin covered some that are being worked through the state and districts, and we thought it was a good idea to cover or give an overview of financial assistance opportunities for landowners as part of the boot camp. So Jared Shippey is the Assistant State Conservationist for Programs for NRCS, who works out of the state office. And Jared, it's all yours.
All right, good morning, everybody, and thanks, Tim. Can you see my screen all right?
Yeah, I see it well.
All right, very good. So as Tim mentioned, my name is Jared Shippey, and I'm the Assistant State Conservationist for Programs based out of the Harrisburg State Office. And just going to touch base briefly here about some of the programs that NRCS has. I'm not going to go into the minute details, but give a brief overview. So before we get started, though, I think that it's very important to note you all are in training right now in Boot Camp 2 as part of a larger curriculum towards your certification, your conservation planning certification process. So Doug Wolfgang had mentioned earlier about this is a generational opportunity for farmers. You just heard Justin talk about some of their new programs, including ACAP, and NRCS is no different. That our funding opportunities have increased dramatically, and we have great opportunities to offer out to producers. But with that great opportunity comes great responsibility. So I think, and Dan Ludwig will probably smile to this because I'm a programs guy, but I think that we certainly need to continue to focus on sound planning first. We have millions and millions of dollars that are coming down the pipeline to spend on these programs and get conservation out on the ground. But sound planning and that background makes good contracts, and I think that Justin would agree with that. And so I think that it's important to maintain our integrity of planning conservation systems and then going to the next step on some of these financial assistance contracts. The second thing I wanted to mention, and Justin, I was happy to hear his presentation on some of the commission's programs, is partnerships, right? So I feel like that, between NRCS and the State Conservation Commission, DEP, Penn State, conservation districts, we're all working together towards the same goal, which is clean water and viable farms, right? We've heard that mentioned a few times. So starting with local working groups and working together with our partners, whether it's the conservation districts or DCNR or somebody else at the local level, to go out and explain to our customers what we have to offer as far as programs, I think goes a long way with customers understanding kind of the ins and outs of everybody's programs and how they work together and how they may partner. Because, a lot of this stuff, we use the comment that it's alphabet soup. And I think you guys have seen a lot of that already today, and we'll continue to next week or throughout the week. So just to get started, and I think it's important to mention on this slide, that work with NRCS is voluntary, free, and confidential. We work directly with customers and to plan and install conservation systems. So as you can see here, the first step is obviously going to be working directly with the customer to develop the conservation plan, working with the technical assistance side and Tim's shop, and then moving towards that financial assistance in order to help reach conservation goals. So when we're starting to plan, what are some of the resource concerns? And here's a list of what NRCS has of resource concern categories that we're looking at the farm. And the way resource concerns are tied into our financial assistance contracts is a little bit different across programs. So here are some of the resource concerns that we're looking at when we're originally going out to do some planning at the farm. And I'm sure if you guys have not seen this many times, you will continue to see that as you go through your training programs. So EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, is probably our most popular program here in Pennsylvania. The Pennsylvania right now the allocation is between $25 and $30 million a year, and that's spread across field offices across the state. So EQIP is a financial and technical assistance to ag producers and also non-industrial private forest managers to address resource concerns on their property. So EQIP is broken down into different categories, such as livestock situations, looking at barnyard stabilization, manure storages, things of that nature. There's also a cropland component, focusing on cover crops, conservation tillage, no-till, grass waterways, structural things of that nature. There's grazing components, prescribed grazing systems, as well as conservation activity plans and lots of things to do within forest land as well. So how does EQIP work? As we talked about earlier, EQIP is a voluntary conservation program. So you can see some of the benefits to EQIP, and as I spoke about before, some of the eligible land uses. So here are some of the popular practices through EQIP: cover crops, no-till, nutrient management. We do a lot of waste storage facilities, also forest buffers, herbaceous buffers, things of that nature. So there's also a list of currently some of the fund pools within EQIP. So as you can see, we do have cropland, livestock, grazing. We have some initiatives such as the Golden Wing Warbler Initiative. An initiative new to this year that we have is the Joint Chief Landscape Initiative, which promotes forest practices and plans in north central and northwestern Pennsylvania. Another new initiative that we have this year in EQIP is through the Inflation Reduction Act. Some of you have, I'm sure, been aware and been working on some of the IRA type applications. And this year in EQIP IRA, Pennsylvania received an additional $3.3 million. So that is going to continue to increase, looking at climate smart agriculture practices. So I do have that list to show you here at some point. Go back and just. So another thing to note, on EQIP, the payments are set up similar to our Ag Management Assistance, which I'll cover next, as well as RCPP, where we pay an incentive payment, so it's not based on actual costs. So the way that's set up through a regional payment schedule team, and we work, like I mentioned before, we work directly with the customer or the contract holder, and we provide them with our Pennsylvania Tech Guide standards and specs. They install the practice, and then we inspect it and pay based off of that. So for those of you that aren't familiar with that, I'll use fence for an example. So for two-strand interior fence, if our incentive payment is $1.40 a foot, and we go out and we measure it and it is installed correctly to specs, then we pay $1.40 a foot based off of that measurement. We don't require any bills. We basically just pay that incentive payment. Next program is our Ag Management Assistance Program. And in Pennsylvania, we have around $200,000 each year dedicated to this program. And this program looks at practices such as cover crops, irrigation, seasonal high tunnels, and many others. It's important to note that Pennsylvania is one of 16 states currently that has the Ag Management Assistance Program. And this has been a popular program for us in the last several years. The application period is continuous, the same as EQIP. And typically when we set up our sign-up rounds, AMA will run continuous with EQIP. So same way with the cost list. Next one is our Conservation Stewardship Program. And this program is set up a little bit differently. This is probably our second most popular program in Pennsylvania right now. The allocation for Pennsylvania is between 10 to 15 million a year. The Inflation Reduction Act initiative is also available under CSP this year. Pennsylvania received an additional 2.5 million to do CSP. So CSP is a little bit different than EQIP, where in EQIP, we're doing that sound conservation planning, we're identifying resource concerns, and then we're using those resource concerns in our CART assessment tool, and then showing how we're going to solve those resource concerns through conservation practices. CSP is a program that's more tailored towards folks that have solved those resource concerns already, maybe through a previous EQIP contract, maybe on their own. But what CSP does is we have targeted resource concerns in the state, and then we go through our evaluation tool, and it gives them a benchmark of how many resource concerns they are currently meeting at the time of planning. And CSP provides existing activity payments based off of how many resource concerns they met. There's also a large suite of practices and activities. Typically through CSP, if they've already installed that minimum threshold through EQIP, it allows them to kind of take to that next tier level of conservation. So an example would be if they were doing single species cover crop through EQIP and they want to do multi-species, they could go through CSP. A lot of forest practices are also popular in CSP, some of the wildlife friendly practices. A lot of you have heard of our pollinator plantings and things like that. So that's been popular through CSP. If they've been doing a base level of nutrient management through EQIP, or maybe installed a waste storage facility that they're currently managing, taking that to the next step in CSP with some advanced nutrient management, maybe some in-season testing, late season stock tests, things of that nature, all fit very well into the conservation stewardship program. CSP contracts are 5 years, and at the end of those 5 years, participants are eligible to re-enroll. So it's a little bit different than our traditional programs. EQIP and AMA are typically 3 to 5 year contracts. RCPP program. So this is the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, and basically it's set up to where we work with partners to deliver conservation assistance. We have several of these across the state of Pennsylvania, mostly targeted through in the Bay Area, but there are some that are statewide. And we look for this program to continue to grow in the future and in the next Farm Bill. So any questions on that? Adam Dellinger is the state program manager. Eligibility. So whenever we look at eligibility for any programs, and specifically EQIP, just because that's our most popular program here. So we look at land eligibility, and we also look at participant eligibility. So we do work with individuals, legal entities, joint operations, tribes, basically as long as they can prove that they have control of the land for the life of the contract. And you can see there what lands are eligible. So as we talked about before, basically we look at all land uses as far as program eligibility. It is noted, though, that these programs are competitive and they are ranked based off of resource concerns, what we're addressing, what practices we're implementing, trying to focus on that systems approach. So applications are accepted on a continuous basis throughout the year. So at any time, a person can come in and apply for these programs, and they can be submitted in person, they can be emailed, fax mailed. We're pretty flexible on how we accept applications. Because the programs are competitive, though, we do have to set sign-up rounds for funding consideration. So typically for EQIP, our first round of signups would be due in mid-October, and that would be for the following fiscal year. So a typical time frame would be we would be reviewing and ranking applications over the winter, and then pre-approving applications February, March, in order for the next year's implementation. And that just has some websites there. I'm sure you all should be familiar with. Let me show this is the list of climate smart activities. So these are the practices that we're going to be focusing on through the Inflation Reduction Act initiative in the next couple of years. So as you can see, these practices are targeted towards climate smart. The practices on the left would be the EQIP, and on the right would be the CSP activities as well. So you can see soil health related. This list is going to be expanding in the future to allow for some additional practices. Okay, and with that said, that's about all I had. I know I kind of rushed through that, but certainly happy to take any questions.
Thanks a lot, Jared. I don't see any questions in the chat, and we've thrown a lot of info at everyone this morning. And I think if you have additional questions, you know some resources and where to go to get some answers. So if there's no questions, we're going to move on to our next presentation. So I'm going to call back Dan Ludwig, our NRCS SRC, and then myself. I'm going to kick off the presentation here. I'm Tim Peters, the State Conservation Engineer for NRCS. So let me share my screen. And can someone let me know that they can see my PowerPoint? Dan, can you see it?
Yeah, we can see
Yep.
it.
All right, thanks a lot. So we wanted to give a talk on Job Approval Authority. And Job Approval Authority is managed at the state level by Dan Ludwig and myself. Dan handles the Ecological Sciences Job Approval Authority, and then the Engineering Job Approval Authority gets worked down through me, the state engineer. And this would be the same case in other states. And we're going to talk about some of the details of job approval. I think it can be confusing at times when it applies, how it applies, what you need to do. But well, yeah, we'll just dive into it. So I am curious, and I can't see the chat, so maybe Dan or Mark, let me know if people are giving some answers. But curious, some of you have job approval, and I don't expect everyone to know the answer to this or have a thought yet even. But for those that do, you know, why do we have job approval authority? Why does it exist? Any thoughts? Back to the chat, which any thoughts on why we have job approval?
Yep, got one so far. Says so we can work under the stamp or the authority of those above us in the agency.
Okay. Any other thoughts?
Create oversight opportunities.
All right. Very good. Well, thanks for the two people that that had some good thoughts, and we're gonna dive into it, and I think we're gonna find that those comments stand at least mostly true, and that that is part of what we're trying to do with job approval. So, as a federal agency, NRCS, we have the responsibility to be accountable for the work that is being completed by the agency, by the staff and the partners that are working underneath that agency. And part of being accountable means that we need to verify and document which employees have the technical ability to do the work. Who can do the work, who can do it independently, who can do the planning, who can approve the designs, and who can certify the constructive practices when they're finished. And so that is the main gist of job approval authority. Now, in order for us to verify accountability, we need to conduct quality assurance and quality control activities, and kind of highlight some of that in this slide here. But these activities ensure that the people working with job approval through NRCS or directly as employees of NRCS or as partners with NRCS doing the same work, that those people are providing functional planning, design, and implementation assistance. And these activities help to ensure that the work is being conducted in a consistent manner and not just consistent from the southeast and the northeast and the west part of the state, but across the country. That overall there's a consistent product that is going out. That doesn't mean that every design package is going to look exactly the same, but it does mean that resource concerns or inadequate practices are being addressed in a similar manner, that resource concerns are being identified the same way, and that they're being addressed in a way that meets the landowner's needs and addresses that problem. Now, additionally, the last part of my slide here says that many states require certain practices be designed and installed under somebody with a license, a professional engineer for engineering in some cases, or it could be an expert, a consultant in the ecological sciences side. And so job approval is a way that the agency can demonstrate that competence. Now, I will say Pennsylvania law requires for engineering that all new or retrofitted liquid and semi-liquid manure storages must be signed off by a professional engineer. So even though we have job approval, still, if it's a liquid storage tank that's going in, we need to have a PE signature on that design. So job approval is good, but we still need to have somebody with a PE. And most of our area engineers across the state are PEs, and the ones that aren't, they would send the designs in to me to sign off. I just wanted to make that distinction there. So job approval ensures that conservation practices are being planned consistently, like I said, designed consistently and installed according to our NRCS standards and specifications. We fall back on standards and specs all the time. That's our Bible. That's what we do everything by. And this ensures that the practices are being planned and installed in a way that meets the intended purpose of that practice and without degrading other resources. We could collect stormwater off a roof with gutters, and we could send that to an outlet, but we could create a new problem depending on where we outlet that. Do we outlet that in a location where there's no vegetation and we're going to create a gully now? Or do we outlet it where there's a rock dissipator and we're going to break up that energy and that water is going to get dispersed and in a stable manner? So we want to make sure that we're not causing new problems by what we're doing to fix other problems. And then I'll also say here that job approval authority helps to ensure that practices at any stage of the project are minimizing the threat to life and property. And we don't want to create a dangerous situation during construction, and we don't want to create a dangerous situation for the operator after it's finished. It also ensures that the practices will function for the life of the practice lifespan. So each of our practices have a designated lifespan. And we want that practice to be able to fulfill its purpose for that lifespan. Now, I will mention, we could design a grass waterway for a 10-year storm event, and you could end up having a 100-year storm event come through. And so that's not really what we're talking about. You always could have a storm event that's bigger, and we will at some point have a storm event that's bigger than what our practices are designed for. But there's a certain expectation that grass waterway, if we were receiving typical rainfall, that would be operational for the practice lifespan. And then finally, we'll say that these practices need to be installed in a efficient manner, financially efficient and constructed efficiently. You could plan the Taj Mahal for every resource concern and have this big, expensive practice go in, but that's not always the right thing to do. And I'll go back to some pictures that Mark Goodson and Dan Ludwig were showing earlier today of some gullies in the field. Well, sure, I could go out and I could design a concrete line channel that would carry water without causing erosion through that entire field. And it would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to do a huge concrete channel for 1,000 feet. But that wouldn't be the right thing to do. That wouldn't be financially efficient. And so that's part of what job approval helps to ensure, is that, hey, we're looking at the right thing to do, the efficient thing to do, and we're taking that into consideration. So around the country, most states only employ a handful of professional engineers, and that was one of the answers in the question that we asked originally, to work under the state engineer's stamp. And that's mostly true. The state engineer is delegated authority by the agency. So I have authority to do projects to a certain job approval level. And then I, as state engineer, am able to delegate engineering job approval authority to the area engineers who can then delegate the staff underneath of them. The state engineer is required to be a professional engineer. So in essence, people doing work underneath job approval through NRCS in Pennsylvania are meeting the requirements needed that I need to meet for being a professional engineer. So they sort of are working under my license. And the same goes for other disciplines on the ecological sciences side, agronomists and grazing specialists and foresters. There's only a limited number of these professions. And so one way that we are able to administer technical assistance is through job approval and to make sure that good quality, competent work is being provided underneath of those state discipline leads is done through job approval. And that's one way that we comply with state law. To do engineering work in Pennsylvania, we're required to be a PE or have a PE signing off on that work. But since we have the job approval system, the NJOM job approval system in Pennsylvania in place, we have staff that aren't having projects signed off by PEs, but still meeting state law because they're working through job approval. And let's see, what else do I want to say here? Something else I'm drawing a blank on. I will say that, here we go. Yeah, job approval. So through job approval authority, inexperienced staff are able to do work with the oversight of an experienced individual who has job approval. So this allows the inexperienced person to gain experience. They can then establish higher technical competencies. They can demonstrate that their abilities are good and that they're able to do the work independently. And they can just gain that those abilities while working under somebody else's job approval. So they could be doing the work and someone with job approval is just giving the oversight. So for example, if a new employee is asked to do a design for an access road and they need to develop a design, well, the new employee will start by working with an experienced technician or engineer who has already documented their ability to do that work independently, and they already have job approval. So the experienced individual is going to review the work of that inexperienced new employee, and they're going to do that for every project until that new employee is able to complete the work independently and on their own. And then when that new employee has gained those abilities, they can then put in a request to get job approval for themselves. They're going to provide the example work that they've completed. It's been signed off and overviewed by somebody who had job approval already, and that's how a new employee can increase their job approval levels. And for engineering, the new staff would be requesting that job approval from the area engineer under which they work. So just good to keep in mind. And we do that for every practice that we have. Every practice that Pennsylvania has adopted that can be found in PHOTOG would have job approval levels established, and employees could gain job approval for those. Okay, moving on. So basically, the job approval authority system identifies that individuals are technically competent to perform the work, that they can do it independently, and then this job approval documents that competency, and it allows individuals with higher levels of the technical ability to delegate the authority to others underneath them. So, for example, the state engineer, I can delegate to the area engineers, and then the area engineers can delegate to staff who are competent and working under their technical supervision. So why was this system developed and used by NRCS? Well, because a standard approach for doing all the work we do, all the planning, design, construction certification, we needed a standard approach to that. And that's why we have job approval. So I'm going to transition over to Dan to talk about the actual policy. And we have a couple of little random thoughts and throughout the presentation. So the first one is, what if there were no hypothetical questions? I love these types of things. So there's two more that are just great. I know you're gonna love them. So Dan, with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. All right. So let's talk a little bit about job approval policy. as Tim had mentioned, it's broken up into two sides, just as we are here in NRCS. We have our engineering division, and we also have our ecological sciences division. So for all of those of you who are interested in becoming a policy rat and would like to read policy and become an expert on it, you can find engineering policy in the General Manual 210, Part 402, and there's also references to it in the National Engineering Manual, and there's your title in the part that you can find it. And ecological sciences were found in General Manual 190, Part 417. We also have a national instruction in 190, Part 311, and then we also have our state-specific instructions, which is filed under 190-006, which is found on our SharePoint, and also we have it posted within the Field Office Technical Guide. Next slide, Tim. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about job approval and why you need it. Okay, so regardless of who you are employed by, it is always important to be working within the scope of your employment. Okay, so what does that really mean? That means that we're working within the scope of our hold on, lost my train of thought. Working within the scope basically means that you're working within the limits of your job approval authority, and you are doing a work according to NRCS standards and specifications. So, and the reason why we have the job approval goes back to what Tim was saying, is that we need to make sure that NRCS and our fellow partner employees are not approving designs beyond your approval level. Also means that we're not checking out practices above our approval level. So again, it comes back to the liability on, because some of these practices have effects on safety and life. So, and as Tim had mentioned, it doesn't mean that we can't design these practices, but essentially when you're designing them and checking them out, you are pretty much saying that these practices are, and I'll use my air quotes, fail safe. They've been designed properly, and also in the checkout that you have the proper ability, knowledge, skills, and ability to know that they have been constructed properly so they will not fail. Okay. So again, if you're awarded job approval, whether it's engineering or ecological sciences, it means you're designing and implementing using the NRCS technical standards and specs, and that you're working within your limitations. Next slide. So Tim has pulled out some of the language from the National Policy on Engineering. And this kind of bleeds over into how ecological sciences works as well. But again, the highlighted parts are the most important take-home messages. Essentially saying that each NRCS providing our technical assistance must be assigned appropriate job approval based on their training, experience, and demonstrated competence. So, and as Tim had mentioned earlier, we can extend job approval to partner employees. So that's where Part B comes in, stating that essentially that you're operating under the technical supervision of an NRCS employee and providing these services. And again, and you're working underneath that job approval. Now, questions do come out and say, can we assign job approval to non-NRCS employees? And we can. So, and essentially what number 3 is saying is that, we can offer it to folks that are not federal employees, who are not licensed to practice engineering when it doesn't conflict with state law. Okay, so again, we have to be, and where that fits in is where we're performing public service similar to NRCS employees and appear to the public as NRCS employees. So this is key to point out because again, if you're not an NRCS employee working with job approval, you have to have that appearance to the public that you are doing work similar to NRCS employees. So again, you're following job approval, and you're having that level of supervision by an NRCS employee. Okay, so have to be careful on, when you use your job approval, if, you have to be able to demonstrate that you're under supervision of NRCS. Next slide. And Tim, if I get any of this wrong, or you want to jump in there, go ahead.
No, you're good, Dan. That's correct. Just giving the appearance of being an NRCS employee is key there, and that's the point we wanted to hit home. Thanks.
Okay, so as I started off here, policy is broken into two different sections. Again, engineering and ecological sciences. Okay, so from the engineering side of things, it requires that the state conservation engineer to be a PE, which Tim is, and then he's responsible for delegating all engineering JAA for all engineering jobs in the state. So basically, that's what the policy is saying. It delegates him as the sole person to essentially be awarding job approval. And it also requires the state engineer to define engineering job classes for those engineering practices. And we're going to get into the difference between job classes, controlling factors, and all that. That's coming up. On the flip side, for ecological sciences, again, that role falls to me. So our policy basically delegates the state resource conservationist to delegate that out, and it gives me the responsibility for the director of the Ecological Sciences Division for recommending those minimum controlling factors for non-engineering practices. And again, we're also defining those job classes basing on controlling factors for state-specific practices. So you might say, well, what are these controlling factors? So controlling factors are elements of a conservation planning pertaining to the scale, complexity, or hazard potential associated with a given practice. So basically, the most limiting feature of a practice identified at a national level becomes that controlling factor. For example, the risk associated with an ag chemical handling facility or waste storage facility increases as storage volume increases. Therefore, the controlling factor for those practices is storage volume. Okay, so that's your controlling factor, is basically the size or the complexity of that project. Job class is the subdivision of the controlling factor. So if we go back to our ag chemical handling facility, we know that the controlling factor is storage volume in gallons. And then we break that down into our job class, which may be something like 500 gallons, 1,000 gallons, 2,000 gallons. So again, these job classes, are defined here at the state level. Okay, next slide. So I'll get into the nuts and bolts of ecological sciences job approval. So we have guidance documents that are out there. So PA state instruction, as I mentioned earlier, is found on the SharePoint and also posted in section 1 of the field office technical guide. So it is open to so there's the ability for non-NRCS employees to access that. One thing we're going to talk about is the term of consistent terminology. talk a little bit about roles and responsibilities. And we'll go into a little bit of the process for assigning ecological sciences job approval. And what you'll find within attachment A to the PA instruction essentially recommends assignments for planners by category. And then we also have we have the documentation requirements for ESJA review and approval. Okay, so how we have these broken down seems how in ecological sciences we have state discipline leads, so they are broken down between our grazing and forages, which falls under our state grazing specialist. All of our forestry practices fall under the state forester, Peter Hoagland. Go back to our state grazing specialist, so that's now going to fall under Brian Campbell. Brian has been on the job for 2 weeks now, so he is taken over the roles that was once held by Susan Perry. And again, any of our biological practices, wildlife falls under our state biologist, and all of our agronomy practices are led by Mark Goodson, our state agronomist. So again, when we first brought out job approval, ecological sciences job approval, believe it or not, has been around for quite some time. It's just that Pennsylvania was one of the last states to adopt it. But if any of you have worked for NRCS in other states, you know that it's been out there for a while. But so again, breaking it down that way, we have this consistent terminology side of things. So again, an ESJA assignment is the process by which authority is granted for each practice phase. Okay, so then, and we're going to talk about practice phases. And then this assignment consists of 3 actions. So we have the request, and that is the action taken by a supervisor to ask for an ESJA assignment. There's the approval. So any staff member can request job approval, but then it has to be reviewed, and that approval comes by the state discipline lead to look at that request and make a decision. And then after that, after it's been approved, it requires concurrence, which is the action taken by the assistant state con for field ops. So whether that's Jeff Warner in the west and Amanda Coleman in the northeast, or Charlie Hanner down in the southeast, they still take a look at what has been approved and they provide concurrence on that. So our practice phases, as I mentioned earlier, is that's broken down into inventory and evaluation, or your I&E, your design and development of conservation practice requirements, and the third one is your construction or checkout or installation oversight. And these 3 phases are the same between the concept is the same between engineering and ecological sciences. So I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so the roles and responsibilities, we have this established at the state level. So again, just like for engineering, I as the SRC have the overall role of awarding ecological sciences job approval. We also have the SDLs who provide input into deciding what needs to be done. And we've also established a board of directors for technical training. So again, as more and more staff want to request job approval or request increases in it, we do look at what technical training is required and to decide, what needs to be developed, when we're going to provide it, and all that. And as I mentioned, at the area level, we have concurrence going on by the ASTCs for field ops, the supervisors, which usually are your supervisory district conservationists, and then even our area administrative coordinators. They pretty much do a lot of the work. They take the requests, put them into the system, and then once everything is followed through, they actually have the responsibility of sending out the reports to field staff. And then we have the field office level, and essentially that is you and our CS staff, affiliates, and our partners. You guys are the ones doing the front work. You are the ones that should be looking at which practices do you do on a regular basis that you need job approval for. Which practices have you been doing, and you need to request increases for that. So all three levels across the state have responsibilities in this whole process. So again, the request, it requires supervisor action. So what that's basically saying is that you as the employee, once you've determined that you need job approval or need increases, then typically you're just having that conversation with your supervisor. If you're a partner or affiliate, you're talking to the DC or the SDC with NRCS to support those requests. Again, the approval phase is held by our state discipline leads who review all those requests and then make a determination. And as mentioned before, your assistants for field ops have that concurrence role. Okay. So here's what it kind of looks like, a little diagram how things would work. Essentially, you as the employee are going to meet from the NRCS side, and even on the partner affiliate side, you're going to at some point meet and talk with the SDC about the need for job approval. And then once they concur with your request, they're going to send that request. So we have a specific request form that needs to be filled out by you as the employee. And then there's also required documentation that shows what you have done in order to either be assigned job approval or be granted increases into it. Our area administrative coordinators essentially have that role of working in the database. We have a huge access database to manage all of this. And essentially, they're putting all those requests in, uploading the documentation. That goes to a SharePoint site where our SDLs can look at it. And then essentially, things that should only be moved to the area administrative coordinator once it's been reviewed and approved by that SDC, and then the SDLs, once they see it, will only process them if we have the request form and the proper documentation. Then again, once that SDL makes that decision, the STC is going to do that concurrence, as I mentioned before. They do have the option to look and see if they need to talk to others to see if that request is, and what's been approved by the SDL is appropriate. And then once they get the go ahead and they've entered that database, the area administrative coordinator will take care of all that documentation. Okay, what's in this lower green box is each NRCS employee and affiliate and partner working to a planner status will receive an ESJA report. Again, we need to be making sure we're maintaining these records. You're discussing with your supervisor throughout the year to determine what levels you need, if you need new practices, and determine when additional training is needed. I think now is a good point to kind of discuss anybody that's from the ecological science side of things. Essentially, once you achieve your level 1 conservation planner certification, there is a list of 18 practices that you can receive a chart for. And once you complete that level 1. The SDC will meet with you, determine, have you been working in the practices that are listed on that report. They have the ability to strike off practices, especially if they're practices that you have not been working with or not familiar with. Again, because we're talking about liability, we don't want to be assigning job approval if you're not comfortable with practices. And then also, as you're working through your level 1, you may have gained a lot of experience over and above what's in this basic report. And at that time, you can request increases in that. And then that goes through the formal request process, which will be our next slide of talking about how do we request. So we have this Excel document that's housed on the Field Office Technical Guide. Again, it's housed in Section 1. It's the second topic. Once you click on Section 1, you'll see the Ecological Sciences job approval. I'll call it a folder, so to speak. But again, what you're going to see here is this Excel document. It allows you to request up to 5 practices on one sheet. What we do request is that you lump them by discipline. So if you've got 2 agronomic practices and 3 grazing practices, you put your agronomy ones on one request form, start a whole new form for your grazing. That way we can get them routed to the correct SDL, and it's a lot easier to track it that way. But again, anything that's in green is where you're going to enter in information. And then if you already have job approval and are requesting additional levels, you want to document what you have. And then over in the other side, once you click the box and you'll see it where it says if requesting changes. Once you put in a date, it's going to open it up so you can put in the requested levels. One thing that we did add to this form, this has been going through a couple revisions, but there's certain practices out there that have pretty much the same. So you'll see here in the select practice over here on the left, I don't have my pointer, but it'll say select practice. There's a drop down where you're going to select that practice. And if there is a practice that has several controlling factors that are essentially the same, it'll list those different practices to tell you, well, you might want to consider if you're going for practice A, you could request these other practices. So we've open this up a little bit, make it a little bit easier, especially for those who are looking to really build their job approval. And essentially, it's going to list what the controlling factor is, the units, and then the different job classes that are out there. Okay. So, and again, this is going to be for anybody that's looking to increase job approval over what they are or currently have or originally assigned. Okay, so let's talk about these 3 phases. So I mentioned these earlier. The 3 phases, is inventory and evaluation, essentially is your planning. And again, that is looking at our on-site observations, assessment tools, preparation for those alternative solutions that we kind of talked about earlier this morning. And then again, you have to have, when you're working on designing practices, you want to make sure that you're doing, getting stumbling on my words here. Essentially having the correct job approval for being able to recommend and talk to the producer about what those practices and the levels that you're most comfortable with. Okay, and then we have the design phase, which essentially is developing supporting data, drawing specifications. This also includes IRs, so even all of our ecological sciences practices have IRs, you do need job approval to approve and sign off on those. But again, it's essentially that design phase is making sure that that plan practice will meet the purpose for which it's being installed and also include specific monitoring or inspection requirements. And then the installation phase or construction phase is, having the job approval to be able to provide that confirmation that a practice is installed according to standards and specs, and actually making that certification of that completed practice. Okay, I see a question from Troy before we get to our random thought. If you acquire JAA in one region and then transfer to another region, say southeast to west or northeast to southeast, or any combination, do all JAs earned transfer with you? The answer is yes. So yeah, you could start your career in the west, get initial job approval, you take a job, you move to a Silicon job in another area. Because it's statewide, yes, it all transfers. You don't have to apply. Nothing changes just by moving in geographical areas within the state. The other thing I'll add, yes.
Can I jump in on the engineering side, which would be a little different? So ecological sciences is being delegated by state discipline leads at the state level, so that'll make sense. But the engineering is a little bit different, where it's actually being delegated by the area engineer of that area. So if you move from one area to another area, I would recommend that you provide your engineering job approval levels to the new area engineer, but you would be working under someone different who is no longer delegated that to you. So wouldn't necessarily stand true exactly the same way as it does for ecological sciences. Sorry to hijack that.
No, that's a good point. But either way, if you earned it in one area, I can't think of even on the engineering side where, if you were working under Zach in the West and you moved to the Southeast and now are working under Wayne, would they remove any of your job approvals? As Tim said, you want to share it, but those levels will transfer. I will add too that if you're working in another state and you've earned job approvals, they will transfer to Pennsylvania. So we've had employees transfer from other states. We ask them to provide their charts. We do a quick review to get them in the database, and essentially, depends on which state you work in. Some of it we aren't just aren't applicable. So like from the west to the east, if you had range practices, typically we're not going to transfer those over because we don't have range in Pennsylvania. But all of our other basic practices will transfer over. So Tim, so for engineer,
right?
yeah. Well, wait a minute. So Troy had another question. So for engineering, you would have to show him a proficiency of different items to ensure you're doing it properly.
Do you have a specific situation, Troy? Maybe we should talk offline. It seems like you ran into something. I'm happy to chat through that with you, but I think Dan's right. Typically, levels are acknowledged from area to area. When it comes to engineering, though, some of the engineering staff and some of the things that are designed are slightly different from area to area. Topography is different. The practices that are being implemented are different. If you came from the Northeast with terrace job approval, where terraces are not done that frequently and done one way, and go to the Southeast, you may need to show some competency. But if you have roof gutter job approvals, roof runoff job approvals, then that probably transfers all over the place. So it really just depends, and it's that area engineer that you are working under at that point. So happy to chat through that, Troy. But providing your levels to the area engineer would be appropriate. And I think never back to me, right? I like this random thought. I couldn't figure out why the frisbee kept looking bigger and bigger. Then it hit. That's funny. That's like a Hosea Latshaw joke. If anybody knows Hosea, he'll share a couple of those jokes at the engineering side of boot camp 2 next week. Oh no, it still is you, Dan. Sorry.
It's still me. You know, we had to break up my talk here. You know, get a little comedic relief here.
I just love that slide so much. I wanted to share it. So back to you, Dan.
You bet. So let's talk a little about this attachment A within the Pennsylvania ESJA policy. Again, it breaks things down and provides the guidance and criteria for our ecological sciences job approval review. It lists the required documentation for submission requests. So, and this is the same for engineering as well. When you're approving or requesting increases in levels or requesting practices in general, you have to submit documentation. So training alone is not going to result in getting job approval. We want to see documentation that shows that you have the KSAs to do that practice before we do it. And maybe I'll steal Tim's thunder, but essentially make sure it's work that you have done and not something that somebody has done a design for you. So again, make sure it's work that you have done because you're the one that requesting that job approval increase or job approval for a practice. We want to see that you have the KSAs to be able to do it. Again, attachment A is going to show you recommendations based on your practice codes, your job classes, list all of our job classes and controlling factors, and it lists those KSAs for your training needs. So some of your supporting documents, you know, as I mentioned before, and you know, have to, it doesn't hurt to repeat the important stuff, but again, you have to have these supporting documents. Required documents can include, you know, at the basic level, is at least the IR job sheet and a conservation plan map. Depending on which practice it is, you may want to provide assessment tool results. So whether you've done SVAP 2, you've done Russell 2, you know, maybe even some of your biological and wildlife practices, your WEGs, you know, anything that can show how you've done that work at the level that you're requesting. So a quick shot of these recommended levels. So when we had to play catch up in 2020 to basically anybody that had been designated a level 1 or level 3 planner were assigned a suite of practices. So I just threw in a quick screenshot to kind of show you what it kind of looks like. So as a level 1, if you were on the books as a level 1 planner, you got I think there was 23 instances. It wasn't 23 practices because there's a couple practices that have multiple controlling factors. So like take cover crop, for example. You know, it actually does have 2 different controlling factors. Most practices have 1, but you're going to find that there's a few practices out there that have more than 1 controlling factor. But essentially, it's recommending that for a level, if you're a level 1 planner, then it's giving these recommended levels for I&E design and your installation certification. So it may be 1s across the board, it may be 2s across the board, but going back to when you're as a level 1 planner, essentially you'll have, once you receive your first initial chart, you'll have 1s for your I&E and 0s on your design and your certification and installation. But again, this is recommended, which you should be achieving 2 as a level 1 planner. But the sky's the limit. You can request what you would like. You just need to be able to provide the documentation that supports these higher levels. And the next one is our level 3 planner. You know, again, same kind of concept. That's 42 different records. not 42 practices because of those multiple controlling factors. But you can see that as a certified planner, you know, our legacy planners were assigned 3s across the board for our job classes. But again, you can use this as you're planning your progression through the years in your career, you know, what you should be going for as you gain more and more experience throughout the years. But again, we're looking at, you know, just because, say, a legacy planner was awarded these 42 records, that does not mean that you need a new employee needs to get all of those. You know, basically, you just need to be looking at what practices are you doing on a regular basis, what practice do you think that you'll be doing, and then build your report. And that's pretty much the same for engineering as well. But again, just a quick show here is the classes and their controlling factors. So again, it's going to be broken down into this, you know, whether it's design complexity, like whether it's crop type, some of them are based on slope. And again, it shows you what the job classes are. You know, they rate from 1 to 5. Some of them are 1 through 3, and then you'll see 4 and 5 are all. So again, that attachment A is going to show is a good example, so you can see what levels or what's required or what's available to request throughout your career. And then talking about our KSA, so again, this gives a list of, you know, what knowledge, skills, and abilities you should have to be able to request that. So again, gives you a basic breakdown of, you know, essentially for each of those different levels, classes 1 through 5, you know, what your knowledge, skills, and abilities should be. So again, it's showing you what you need to know for your increases or requests for new practices altogether. And it can also help you determine which trainings that you need to take over time to increase your job approval. And essentially, you know, for those of NRCS employees, you know, that's easy. You know, you can work that through your IDP, especially if you need some of the trainings provided through EDS. You know, IDP is a great way to track what trainings that you need. Okay, now you can go back to the next slide. So again, this is a printout of what the basic report looks like. So you're going to see that it's going to list your practice, again, your controlling factor, your job classes, and then it's going to show when it was approved and concurred, so you can keep track of this. Essentially, both engineering and ecological sciences are reviewed on a 3-year basis. So again, and it's your responsibility as the planner and the holder of job approval to track these dates and make sure that, you know, once 3 years have passed, you get that to get that in for review for concurrence to maintain those levels. The possibility also exists that if you've never done any of these practices, there could be the request to remove job approval. So again, you always want to be, once you're assigned it, you want to demonstrate that you're using these practices and keeping up to date with them and any changes that might happen through practice standard changes or revisions. And with that, I think now we're going to turn it over to you, Tim.
All right, thanks, Dan. Appreciate it. So getting back to the engineering side, this is the cover sheet that typically goes along with engineering job approval. Engineering job approval is handled very similar as ecological sciences is. You're going to have a sheet similar to the sheets that Dan showed, but it's going to be engineering practices. And like I mentioned, it's delegated by the area engineer, and they have their levels delegated from the state engineer. Systems across the country. So you see here, though, on the have a signature for the technical determination. That's the person delegating the job approval to an employee. And this is mine from a couple of years ago, and you can see Pete Vanderstappen delegated to me. But then it was also concurred by my supervisor, who was Jeff Warner. And so we do have that potential job approval. And then since it's reviewed every 3 years, we just make it easy to show documentation of that, where we can have the delegating technical determination person initial it and date it every 3 years. And we ask that staff monitor that. It's the responsibility of the staff to make sure their levels are being reviewed every 3 years. So just to highlight, the engineering practices are listed, and Dan talked about controlling factors, and the exact same for engineering. I will point out though, excuse me, some of the practices have several controlling factors. Now, not all of them are always going to be applicable. For example, roof span under 313 isn't going to apply to a liquid storage tank, but liquid storage tank capacity is going to apply. Wall height above ground could apply. Wall height below ground could apply. So there's a variety of controlling factors that you have to check, and you could end up with, you know, a liquid storage tank that has a capacity below 50,000 cubic feet of storage, but maybe it's 16 feet below the ground. Well, in that case, your project is a class 5. A class 5, so you would need class 5 approval to be able to approve that design or certify the construction. And just to highlight, staff need to pay attention to their planning levels. That would be IE on the job approval sheet. So that's being able to plan the practices. The design, as Dan talked about all this, the design levels, being able to approve a design. So you don't need job approval to do the design, you need job approval to approve it. And then construction levels. So you don't need job approval to inspect a project, but you do need job approval levels to certify the construction's been done. And so that final certification needs to be done by someone who has that job approval level. I will say though, inspectors are usually assigned based on a quality assurance plan. So that dictates who is the inspector. So the person designing the project is going to work with the supervisors and determine who is listed in that QAP. All right, so the structure. We've said this a couple of times, but engineering job approval by policy goes to the state engineer. They just automatically have it, and then they delegate to, in Pennsylvania's case, the area engineers in the west, northeast, and southeast, and then the area engineers delegate to the staff that are under their technical supervision within their area. And I'll highlight this. I really like this, and it's the PA NRCS fact sheet number 6, which is NRCS Engineering Job Approval Authority. It's available on our website right now. It's soon to be moved to PHOTOG, and whenever we do that, we'll put a note on the website. But this is just a great overview of job approval. It really breaks it down nicely, and I think it's a good resource. So if you ever need or have some questions about job approval, here's a place you could go. You could go to policy, you could go here. You could call me or Dan too, and we can get you answers. But this is just something that could be shared with new people that are just getting into job approval. So some practical applications, getting into, we talked about policy and how it works, but getting into some of the practical components of it. But before we do that, another random thought. People who take care of chickens are literally chicken tenders. That's so, I wish I could hear all of you laughing out loud, because I'm sure you are. That's a funny joke, and like I said, be prepared for more of those next week if you're on the engineering side, and we'll be with Jose at all. Okay, so practical. We talked about demonstrating competence. Demonstrating competency. What does that mean for engineering job approval? Well, job approval isn't given out haphazardly. It's given out after employees have demonstrated competence, and that's important to me. The area engineers are taking responsibility for the work that's being done by staff who are using job approval underneath them. And I'm taking responsibility for everybody within Pennsylvania that's using engineering job approval. It's a reflection on me, and I have a responsibility to make sure that work is done well. And so that's what we're doing with job approval. So to demonstrate competence, like Dan mentioned, he did steal my thunder. You know, work is being done independently. It's being completed independently. When I was an area engineer delegating job approval, many times I would have people send me a design example and say, hey, can I get my job approval levels increased? And I would say, sure, send me some work. So they would send me some work, and they would maybe have done the drawings, but not the calc. So they maybe would have put together some of the supporting documentation, but didn't finish the entire package. And so I would always go back and say, hey, this is good. You're on your way to getting there, but this just shows me that you can do work with somebody else's help. And to get job approval, we need to demonstrate that we can do it independently. And it should be from within a couple of years. I've had people that want a job approval increase, and they would send examples from 12 years ago. And standards have changed, policies have changed, the way we do work has changed, the industry standards have changed, materials, all these things evolve over time. So we want to be looking at work that is recent. And I say within a couple of years, within 3 years is a good rule of thumb. Now, just keep that in mind. You don't want to pull something off the shelf and have to dust it off before you provide it. Provide some example inspection. If you want the construction job approval levels, then just share, hey, I inspected this job and these are the practices that were involved, and it was certified by so and so. We absolutely have to be making sure that we're demonstrating knowledge of NRCS standards. Like I said, that's what we fall back on always. The criteria in those standards, that's what everything that we do gets established based on. And so anybody that's getting job approval should demonstrate that they understand the ins and outs of that practice standard that goes along with the practice that they are trying to get job approval levels for. And then what else do I say here? Understand their own limitations. This was big for me when I was an area engineer delegating to staff. I was much more comfortable giving higher job approval levels to somebody that I knew would come and ask questions when something came up. Whenever there was an employee who regularly reached out to me and said, hey, I'm not sure about this, what do you think? Got my opinion on the situation, or if there was a problem that came up, I knew that they would call me. I'm much more comfortable giving levels to that person rather than the person who never reaches out, that I never hear from, that is just going off and doing everything on their own without working as a team and with others. That concerns me, because I'm not sure if that person's overly confident or if they just don't want to reach out or whatever the reason. It's just a concern, and I didn't always delegate quite as high an engineering job approval levels to groups like that or to staff like that. And then I mentioned it earlier, but you have to have an engineering degree to certify 313 or 367. So you're not going to get design job approval or construction certification job approval for 313 practices, because you do have to be a PE to sign off on those. And then it's just a Pennsylvania thing where we reserve design job approval and certification job approval typically for people who have engineering degrees or license in Pennsylvania for those practices. So there's just a much higher risk with those practices, and to meet state law in some cases is the reason we do that. Only NRCS employees can delegate job approval. That question came up this year to me, which I thought was interesting. And for engineering job approval, the only employees delegating it would be the area engineers and the state engineer. So other staff do not delegate to other people. So if you're a experienced CET in the western part of the state and you're working with some new employees, that's great, but they're still going to need to request job approval changes from the area engineer. Okay. So obtaining engineering job approval authority. Kind of similar to ecological sciences. It's less formalized, but first, get your supervisor's support. We want the supervisor to have input and to back the request that's being made. And whenever somebody asks me for job approval changes, level changes, that's the first thing I would do. I would call the supervisor and say, hey, do you concur? And sometimes they do, sometimes they didn't, which was interesting. So make sure you're talking to your supervisor. Work with the area engineer, and then submit example work. Submit that independently completed work to the area engineer to see. And a great situation is when maybe you're doing a design, you don't have job approval to approve it yet, so you're sending that design into maybe the area engineer to review. That's a great way to show that you are independently doing work. That area engineer can review it and sign off, and they can see exactly how well a person is doing and how competent they have become if the area engineer is able to review that project for them. And when it comes to engineering projects, engineering designs, all of our work is peer reviewed. every single engineering design should be peer reviewed by somebody. So sending it off to get it approved by somebody who has job approval when you don't doesn't really slow down the process at all. It's just we have to have a review done anyway, so you might as well take advantage of that. What else? Work within your job approval levels and within your abilities and under NRCS technical supervision. I'm going to hit that in the next slide, and then reviewed every 3 years, like Dan has said, and I think we've said a couple times. So a big question that came up has been coming up, and what does it mean to work under NRCS technical supervision? What does it mean to work under an area engineer's technical supervision? If they're delegating job approval, that person needs to be under their technical supervision. And so I'm saying that it applies when the area engineer is aware of the work being done. So if we have a partner who is just off doing their own work all the time and the area engineer has no clue about it, that's probably not under technical supervision. And that's a red flag there that work is probably not going to be covered by job approval. Let's see. It means that work is being completed in the same manner as NRCS projects. So we hit that before, but it's key. It has to meet NRCS standards and specs. It has to. Everything we do has to meet standards and specs. And anytime NRCS provides any technical assistance, and anytime any technical assistance is provided through job approval, it has to meet the standards and specs, even if that's just giving advice. I can't go out to a landowner and give them some sort of advice informally if it doesn't meet standards and specs. I have to be mindful of that all the time, and anybody working under job approval would be in the same boat. I think that technical supervision to me means that employees are participating in a lot of the same trainings. Now, that doesn't mean that you're attending everything, but it does mean that you're interacting in the same way that NRCS staff would be if you're a partner trying to work under technical supervision. Under technical supervision also means that work is being spot checked. NRCS, we spot check work. We rotate around and typically hit a county every 3 years. And so part of that is looking to see the work that's been completed by staff with job approval in that county. So we need to make sure that that's happening for a person to be under the technical supervision of that area engineer. And then I just say here, we've hit this before, but the work meets NRCS planning and design requirements all the time. Maybe we didn't say this. Maybe this is the first time we say this. What I'm saying here is that we can't have somebody that's, and this mostly applies to partners, we can't have a partner that wants to work under job approval, have half of their work meet standards and specs and look like NRCS projects, and then the other half of their time, they're off doing work that doesn't meet standards and specs. They're doing things that are inconsistent with that. Well, going back to policy that Dan shared, a person has to give the appearance to the general public of being an NRCS employee, that their work would look like an NRCS product. And if a employee, if half of their work doesn't give that appearance, then that person wouldn't really give the appearance of being an NRCS employee. So just to hit that really all the work needs to be consistent. Okay, so we've hit this, and I'm going to fly through it. But if you're a new employee working on a project with practices you don't have job approval, that doesn't mean you can't do it. You still can do the I&E, you just need somebody to sign off on it. You still can do the design, you just need somebody else to approve it. And you still can inspect, you just need somebody else to certify the completed project when it's all finished. And working with somebody that has that job approval authority, they're taking responsibility for the work at that point. And I'm hungry, so I want to keep moving. I talked about spot checks. Typically, we're looking at 5% of all installed practices as part of that spot check. So, like I said, we rotate around usually in like a 3-year cycle, and we are hitting 5% of the work. There's some caveats to that, but that's a good rule of thumb. In the event that an issue is identified, maybe we've hit something on a spot check and found that there is a problem, job approval levels can be changed and they can be addressed. And Dan said this earlier, we can increase job approval levels and we can reduce them as well. It's infrequent in my experience that we have had to reduce job approval levels. I can count on one hand the times I had to do that when I was area engineer, but it does happen from time to time. So making sure that once you have job approval, you're continuing to do quality work and meeting the standards and specs. So Dan, to summarize,
Yes, because everybody's hungry. So, in summary, so job approval authority is, it's our method of quality control, quality assurance. It's a benchmark of your technical abilities. And essentially, it's essential to deliver technical assistance. So, again, our technical assistance is a tool for customer service. Job approval authority is not. It's not an employee entitlement. You have to earn it. It's just not given out freely, as Tim has mentioned. It's not a certification, and it's not a mark of seniority. So, know the limits of JAA. So you have to always know the standards. Certify only practices that meet standards and specs. Only approve things for which you feel comfortable for, and ask for help when you're unsure. The other thing I was going to mention too is, especially with our partner employees, working under the appearance of NRCS. So again, NRCS being aware of the projects are going in. So partners that are writing a lot of ag ENS plans does not fall under the appearance of working under NRCS, because we work in conservation plans. So just be mindful of those of you that are writing ag ENS plans. Is job approval appropriate for that, or is NRCS job approval awarded for those types of practices and implementation? Okay, just a couple more slides. So don't get too excited. Okay, you're going to find that. Don't stress, because it does work out in the end. All right, with that, any questions?
I think we answered Troy's, and we are happy to answer questions at any time. I do have a poll to release, and you can answer this poll over lunch. I'm going to launch it right now. Go ahead and answer that poll question, which should have popped up. And with that, we're going to take a 30-minute lunch break. So we will be back at 12:40. And I'm going to get my clock back up here. Get this going. So we'll see you all at 12:39 or 12:40. Thank you.